My son told me to sell my house and move in with them. Then he charged me. Rent. There is a particular sound an envelope makes when a man slides it across a table toward his own father, and I will hear it for the rest of my life. It's a small sound, a dry whisper of paper on wood. My son Craig made that sound one evening in early spring, sliding a plain white envelope across his kitchen table toward me, over the remains of a dinner I'd helped pay for, in a house I had just sold my own home to move into. "It's nothing to get upset about, Dad," he said, in that reasonable voice he'd been practicing on me for months. "We just think it's fair that everybody who lives here contributes. Denise did up the numbers. It's more than fair, honestly. It's less than market." I opened the envelope. Inside was an invoice, a real one, typed up neat, with a little logo at the top from the template his wife used for her side business, itemized like I was a stranger renting a room off the internet. Room and board, utilities, a share of the property taxes, a monthly figure at the bottom, underlined. My son was charging me rent. Rent to sleep in a back bedroom of a house. And here is the part he had forgotten. The part none of them had ever really understood. The part that would, in the end, bring the whole thing down around their ears. Rent to sleep in a house whose deed, whose actual legal title, had my name on it and had never once had his. But I didn't say that. Not then. I want you to understand the discipline of it, because the discipline is the whole story. I sat at that table, 75 years old, 2 years a widower, and I looked at the invoice my own son had typed up to charge me for the privilege of living under a roof I owned, and I did not throw it in his face. I did not tell him what I knew. I folded it back up, and I put it in my shirt pocket, next to my heart where I keep the things that matter, and I said, "All right, son, that seems fair. I'll bring you a check in the morning." And I watched something flicker across his face, surprise, maybe even a flash of shame, quickly smothered, and then relief, and then that awful oily satisfaction of a man who has just gotten away with something and can't quite believe how easy it was. And his wife Denise, drying a dish at the counter with her back to us, went still for just a second, listening, and then went back to her drying, and I understood that she'd been listening for exactly that answer, and that she'd gotten it. I paid the rent. I want to say that plainly because I'm not too proud to tell you I paid it. The next morning I wrote Craig a check for a room in my own house, and I handed it to him, and he took it. And he didn't quite meet my eyes, and I went out to the garage where they let me keep a workbench, and I sat there among my old tools for a long while and let my hands stop shaking. And then I paid it again the next month, and the month after that. The month. For a while, I paid a man rent to live in a house I held the deed to, and I said thank you, and I kept my mouth shut, and I let all of them, Craig and Denise, and the smooth strangers they were starting to bring around, believe that the old man was exactly as beaten and foggy and finished as they needed him to be. Because I am a locksmith. I was a locksmith for 50 years, built a business out of it, Ferris lock and security, from a bicycle and a canvas bag of picks to a real company that put the locks and the safes and the alarm systems on half the businesses in this county. And there is a thing you learn, doing that work for 50 years, that most people never learn at all. You learn patience. A good lock does not yield to force. Force just breaks the wrench and skins your knuckles and tells the lock you're coming. A good lock yields to a man who is willing to sit with it, quiet, patient, feeling for the tumblers one at a time, waiting for each one to fall into place with that small click that only you can feel until the last one gives and the whole thing turns like it was never locked at all. That's how you open a lock that doesn't want to be opened, not with a hammer, with patience and a steady hand, and the willingness to be underestimated for as long as it takes. My son thought he'd locked me out of my own life. He thought he'd sold my house out from under me and moved me into a back room and put me on a rent schedule and taken the wheel of everything, and that all that was left was to wait for the old man to sign the last few papers and fade away on a comfortable schedule. What he didn't know, what he had genuinely arrogantly forgotten, was that he'd locked the door on a locksmith. And I was already, quietly, feeling for the tumblers. Before I tell you what I found when I finally started running my hands over the machine my son and his wife had built around me, and I promise you, it was so much worse than a rent invoice, so much colder than you're imagining right now. Let me ask you one small favor. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight and how old you are, because I have a feeling some of you know exactly the chair I'm talking about. The back bedroom chair, the guest in your own family chair. And some of you love somebody who's sitting in it right now. And if you have ever been told, gently, reasonably, with a smile, that the smartest thing you could do was hand over the thing you spent your whole life building, your house, your savings, your independence, to the very people who were supposed to protect it, do an old locksmith a kindness and hit that like button and subscribe. Because this is the story of what happens when a quiet old man that everyone has agreed to stop taking seriously turns out to be the one man in the house who still knows exactly who holds the key. Stay with me to the end. The end is the tumbler they never felt coming. And I'll promise you one thing right at the start, so you know what kind of story you're in for. There's no shouting in it. There's no scene where the old man finally loses his temper and throws the china and says the thing he can't take back. That's not how a locksmith works, and it's not how a locksmith wins. I won this the way I opened every lock that ever gave me trouble. Quietly, patiently, one tumbler at a time, by keeping my hands steady when everyone was sure they'd started to shake, and by remembering the one thing my son forgot, that the man making the most noise in a room is almost never the man who holds the key. He's usually just the one most afraid you'll notice he doesn't. To understand how I ended up paying rent in my own house, you have to go back before it, to the thing that took the fight out of me long enough for them to try. You have to understand Nora. The house was too quiet without her. That was the first thing every single morning, before I was even all the way awake. The quiet. 46 years of marriage, and Nora had filled every corner of our days with sound. The click of her knitting needles in the evening, the kettle, the way she talked to the plants and to the cat and to the man on the television who she was sure could hear her. She had a laugh that came out in a little rush, like she'd surprised herself with it. And for 46 years, I'd come through the back door at the end of a long day and hear that laugh and know I was home. Then her heart started to fail. Congestive heart failure, the doctor called it. In a small room with a diagram on the wall, on a Tuesday I'll remember, until my own heart stops. And it took her slow, over the better part of a year, one flight of stairs at a time, one shortened breath at a time, until at the end she couldn't cross the kitchen without stopping to rest. My Nora, who used to dance me around that kitchen. And then one morning, she was gone, and the house I'd wired with my own hands, the safest house on the block, the house with the good locks and the good alarm, turned out to have no defense at all against the one thing that took her. And after that, it was just a quiet box, and I rattled around in it like the last bolt in an empty toolbox. Grief does a strange thing to time. Some mornings I'd reach across the bed before I was awake and find her side cold and lose her all over again, fresh. Some mornings I'd put 2 cups out from 46 years of habit and then stand there looking at the second one. I couldn't make my hands throw out her reading glasses, or her slippers by the door, or the little jar of hand cream on the windowsill that still smelled like her when I couldn't stand it anymore and opened it. There's a thing about the last of it I've never told a soul, and I'll tell you because you've stayed with me this far. Near the very end, when Nora could barely cross a room, when the nights were long and she slept sitting up because lying down stole what breath she had left, she woke one night and found me awake in the chair beside her, the way I was every night, and she reached out and took my hand, that hand that had kept 46 years of books, that had rested on the back of my neck on all the worst nights of my life. And she said, taking her time, a few words at a rest, "Raymond, the papers, don't ever sign the papers, whatever they tell you. Promise me you'll keep your name on the papers." And I thought, in my grief and my tiredness, that she was wandering back in the old worries, and I said, "I will, sweetheart, don't fret about papers now, just rest." And she squeezed my hand harder than I thought she had left in her, and she looked at me with those eyes that stayed clear right to the end, clearer than mine have ever been, and she said, "Not the shop papers, our papers, Craig's house. You keep your name on it. You'll see why. You'll see." And then she was too tired, and she slept. She was gone within the week, and I did not understand what she'd meant. I truly didn't. I thought it was the fog of the end. Until a year and a half later, standing in a library parking lot with Saul Weinstein on the phone, saying, "You are the cloud" on the title, and it all came back to me at once. She knew. Dying, out of breath, she knew what was coming, better than I did with all my years of judging men and metal, and she spent some of the last strength in her body trying to hand me the key. That's the woman they thought I was too broken to fight for. They had no idea what she'd left inside me. People tell you grief gets lighter. It doesn't. You just build stronger shoulders or you don't. And in those first months, my shoulders weren't strong yet. And my family took the measure of that the way you'd measure a door frame before you fit it. And they made a quiet decision. They decided a man with a broken heart is a man who won't notice what's being carried out the door. They decided grief had made me soft and manageable and slow. And for a while, God help me, they were right. For a while I was so lost in missing Nora that I let things slide I would never in my working life have let slide. I stopped checking things I'd always checked. I signed where I was told to sign, or nearly. I let my son, in the fog of it, get his hands on a great deal that I'd spent 50 years holding myself. What none of them understood, because none of them had ever loved anybody the way I loved Nora, is that a broken heart doesn't make you blind, not forever. Sometimes it's the only thing that finally clears your eyes. And there's a thing they never once accounted for in all their arithmetic. When you have already buried the one person you would have died to protect, you run clean out of fear. A man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous man in any house. They looked at me and saw a sad old fool in a back bedroom. What was actually sitting there, going quiet, going patient, feeling for the tumblers, was a man they should have been afraid of. Let me tell you about Nora and about how we built what we built, because you can't understand what my son tried to take unless you understand what it cost to make it and who really made it. We started with nothing. People say that and don't mean it. I mean it. When Nora and I married, I had a bicycle, a canvas bag of picks and blanks, a second-hand key-cutting machine I'd bought on time, and a reputation in a few square blocks as the young fellow who could get you back into your house when you locked yourself out and wouldn't charge you an arm for it. That was the whole of it. I was 24, and I knew locks. I could feel my way through a pin tumbler in the dark. I could fit a key by hand. I could crack a safe whose combination had died with its owner. But I didn't know the first thing about running a business. Nora did. Nora kept the books at our kitchen table with a ledger and a coffee can full of pencils, and she was harder-headed about $1 than any banker who ever looked down his nose at us. I did the work you could see. She did the work that held it up. I'll give you one picture of her so she's real to you. Every Friday night, for decades, Nora sat at that kitchen table with the ledger and the coffee can of pencils and did the week. What came in, what went out, what we owed, what we could pay. And she had a rule I used to tease her about. She paid every man who worked for us first, before we paid ourselves, before the rent on the shop, before anything. The men eat first, Raymond, she'd say. We eat last. That's how you keep men, and that's how you sleep. There were Fridays we ate last, and it wasn't much. But in 50 years, we never once missed a payroll. Not in the lean years, not in the bad winters, not ever. Because Nora would sooner have sold her wedding ring than let a man who trusted us go home short to his family. I learned the whole of my reputation from that woman at that table with those pencils. People thought the honesty of Ferris Locke was mine. The man out front with the picks and the handshake. It was hers. When I tell you they underestimated me, understand what I really mean. They underestimated her. They looked at a grieving old widower and never once reckoned that he'd spent 46 years married to the sharpest, straightest, most quietly formidable person any of them would ever meet. And that she'd spent those years building things into him, rules, habits, a way of seeing, that didn't die when she did. When the time came, I didn't beat my son with my own cleverness. I beat him with Nora's. I just happened to be the one still standing to do it. We called it Ferris Lock and Key back then. And for a long time, it was just me on that bicycle, and then me in a used van, and then me and one apprentice, a good kid named Denny, who I paid in cash on Fridays when there was cash to pay him with. There were years we ate a lot of cold suppers standing up, because sitting down was time we couldn't spare. There was a winter I worked a whole ice storm straight through, going house to house for people locked out in the cold, frozen door locks and frozen fingers, and came home with $40 and a fever. And Nora put me to bed and laughed and said we were rich in ways the bank couldn't count. There was a stretch when a big customer went under, owing us more than we could stand to lose, and I sat at that kitchen table one night with my head in my hands, certain we were finished, and Nora sat down next to me and put her hand on the back of my neck. She had a way of doing that, her hand on the back of my neck, that could hold a man's whole world together. And she said, "Raymond, you can open any lock ever made. You think you can't open the lock on one bad year? we'll pick it, same as anything else, slow and steady and together. And we picked it. We always picked it. Let me tell you one job, because it says everything about how the thing was built and what it was made of. Maybe our 5th year, a call came in the middle of the night. I still remember the phone ringing in the dark, Nora turning over, me stumbling to answer it. It was the owner of a little downtown bakery, an old man himself by then, and his safe wouldn't open. The one with the morning's float, and worse, the combination his late wife had set, that he'd never written down and now couldn't remember. And his ovens were already going, and his people were already coming in, and if that safe didn't open, he couldn't make change, and couldn't open his doors, and might lose the day, and the way small shops run, maybe more than the day. Nobody would come out. It was the middle of the night. So, he called the young fellow named Ferris on a chance. And I got dressed in the dark, and I drove down there, and I sat on the floor in front of that old safe for 2 hours with my fingers on the dial and my ear to the door, feeling for the wheels to drop in a cold, dark bakery that smelled of rising bread. And a little after 5 in the morning, the last wheel fell and the handle turned, and that old man wept. Because it wasn't just the money, it was the last combination his wife had ever set, and I'd opened it without breaking it, without drilling it, so it was still hers. I charged him the fair price, the same price I'd have charged at noon on Tuesday. And that baker sent me every shopkeeper he ever knew for the next 30 years, and told every one of them the same thing, that Ferris shows up in the dark and opens what can't be opened and charges you honest and treats the thing you're trying to protect like it matters. That's how you build a business, not with cleverness, one dark of night phone call at a time, by being the one who comes when nobody else will, and charging fair when you could have gouged so a man remembers you for 30 years. My son never understood that. He thought the business was the money. He never once understood that the money was only ever the echo of the trust, and the trust was the actual thing. And you cannot pick the lock on trust or forge it or refinance it. You can only earn it, slow, in the dark, for 50 years. And it grew. A shop, then a bigger shop, then commercial work, the real money, putting the security on office buildings and banks and warehouses, the vaults and the master systems, and, later, the electronic access, the card readers, and the cameras. Though I'll be honest, my heart always stayed with the old iron, with a good deadbolt and a key cut true. Ferris Lock and Key became Ferris Lock and Security, and the name meant something in this county. It meant a man who showed up when he said he would. It meant an honest price and work that held. It meant that when a business owner needed to trust somebody with the keys to everything he had, literally the keys to everything he had, he called Ferris because everybody knew old Ray Ferris would sooner cut off his own hand than betray a trust. 50 years I held other people's keys. 50 years I knew the combination to half the safes in this town. And not once, not one single time did I ever misuse it. That was the whole of my reputation. And my reputation was the whole of the business. And the business was Nora and me, cold suppers and all, for 46 years. By the time Nora's heart began to fail, we'd done well. Not rich. I want to be careful about that word, because that word is the exact poison that got into my son. But solid, comfortable. We'd paid off our house decades before, the house we raised the kids in. A good sturdy house I'd wired and locked and cared for like it was one of the family, because in a way it was. We had money set aside. Real money, the slow, honest accumulation of 50 years of steady work and Nora's iron thrift. We owned what we owned free and clear, and we owed nobody anything, and we'd earned every dollar of it clean. And we'd done one more thing with our money years back, a thing that seemed at the time like nothing but ordinary kindness, and turned out, in the end, to be the lock they could never pick. But I'll come to that. First you have to meet my children. Nora and I had 2 children, and I loved them the way you love your own. Completely and without ever quite seeing them straight. Let me introduce them, because both of them have a part in this, and one of them has the biggest part of all. My oldest is Craig. He came out of the gate wanting. That's the truest thing I can say about my son, and I've had 2 years to find a truer one and failed. Craig always wanted the thing the other kid had, wanted the shortcut, wanted the appearance of the thing more than the thing itself. He was a good-looking boy with an easy way about him, and he learned young that charm could get him what work got other people, and he never entirely unlearned it. I brought him into the shop when he was a teenager, tried to teach him the trade, and he had the hands for it. That's what breaks my heart. He actually had good hands. But he didn't have the patience, and worse, he was ashamed of it. He thought fixing locks was small. He'd stand in the shop in a nice shirt he'd bought on a credit card, and you could see him wishing he were anywhere that looked more like money. So he went into real estate and then into mortgages, into the business of houses instead of the business of building anything. And for a while, when the market was easy, he did well, or looked like he did well, which for Craig was the same thing. He drove the car. He wore the watch. He and his wife lived in a house that looked, from the road, like success. There was a day I should have understood, and didn't. We threw a party at the shop once, years back, for the 25th anniversary of Ferris Lock, and half the county came. Customers and old apprentices and men whose businesses I'd kept secure for a quarter century, and it was one of the proudest days of my life. And I overheard Craig, grown by then, in one of his good shirts, talking to a couple of people he was trying to impress. And one of them asked friendly whether he was going to take over the family business someday. And my son laughed and he said, "God, no. No offense to my dad, but I'm not going to spend my life on my knees in front of other people's doors." On my knees in front of other people's doors. He said it light, like a joke, and the people chuckled, and he didn't know I'd heard, and I told myself it was just a young man wanting his own path, nothing to it. But I've thought about that sentence a great deal since. Because that's how my son saw 50 years of honest work that fed him and housed him and put him through school. A man on his knees. He never once saw that the man on his knees in front of the lock is the man everyone trusts with the key to everything they own, and that there is no higher thing you can be in this world than trusted like that. He wanted the watch. He couldn't see the trust. And a man who can't see the trust will always, in the end, sell it because he never knew it was the valuable thing. I have to tell you about the house because the house is the whole hinge of this story. About 15 years ago, Craig and Denise found a house they wanted and could not afford. They came to us, to Nora and me, and they asked for help. And we helped, because that's what you do for your children. But here's what we actually did, and here's where Nora, God rest her, saved my life a decade before I knew it needed saving. We didn't just hand Craig the money. Nora wouldn't have it. Nora had watched her own sister get bled white by a son-in-law who'd been helped onto the deed of a house. And Nora had a rule, and she sat me down at that kitchen table and laid it out with her finger tapping the wood the way she did when she meant business. "We'll buy them the house, Ray," she said. "We'll pay for it, and they'll live in it, and it'll be their home, and we'll never charge them a dime. But the deed stays in our name, in the trust, until they've paid us back in full and we're both gone or we decide otherwise. You be generous with your children, Raymond, generous as the day is long, but you keep your name on the papers. The day you sign the papers over is the day you find out what a person really thinks of you. And by then, it's too late. I've seen it. I won't have it in our family." So that's what we did. We bought Craig and Denise their house outright with our money, and we put the deed in our name, held in a family trust that Nora set up with our lawyer, and we told them plainly it was theirs to live in and would come to them in time, and we never charged them a cent, and we never mentioned it again. Craig paid us back a little here and there in the early years, and then stopped, and we let it go, because he was our son, and it was his home, and we didn't need the money. 15 years he's lived in that house. 15 years he's called it his. And in 15 years, it never once occurred to him to check whose name was actually on the deed. Because why would a man check the lock on a door he's sure he owns? The deed sat in Nora's trust, quiet, forgotten by everyone but me. A locked box in the dark with only one key. Remember that house. We're going to come back to that house. My other child is Kate, my daughter. And Kate is the one I nearly lost twice. Once to distance and once to a lie, and I'll get to the lie. Kate was the different one, the serious one, the one who took after Nora in the way that counts. She didn't want the shop, and she didn't want the appearance of money. She wanted a real thing, and she went and got it, made herself into a paralegal, good at it, careful, the kind of person who reads every line of every page because she's seen what hides in the lines nobody reads. Kate married a good, steady man and moved 3 states away for his work. And we didn't see her as often as I'd have liked, and after Nora died, we saw her even less. And there was a reason for that. A reason I didn't understand at the time, and that makes my blood run cold now. But in those first grieving months, I told myself it was just distance, just life, just my daughter far away with her own family. I told myself, Craig, who was right here, who came around, who handled things, was the one being the good child. I got that exactly backwards. It took me far too long, and it cost me far too much to understand that the child who's always right there handling everything is sometimes right there because he's the one who needs you. Not to look too closely, and the child who's kept at a distance is sometimes kept there on purpose by the one who can't afford to have her in the room. There are grandchildren too, and I have to tell you about one of them especially because she's the light in all of this. The reason I can tell this story without it being only dark. Craig and Denise have a daughter, Ivy. She's 16. And Ivy is the one who used to come down to the shop with me on Saturdays when she was little, the only one of the whole younger crowd who ever wanted to, and sit on the stool at my bench and watch me work, and ask 1,000 questions, and learn to cut a key straight, and pick her first practice lock at 9 years old, with her tongue between her teeth and her grandmother's stubborn concentration on her face. Ivy has the hands. Ivy has the patience. Ivy is ashamed of her parents in the quiet, careful way of a good kid trapped in a house going wrong, and she loves me. And I love her more than I know how to say. And everything I did, when the time came to do it, I did with one eye, always on making sure that whatever fell on Craig would never, ever fall on Ivy. Keep her in your mind, too, because in the end, the deed to the house and the money in the safe were never the most important thing I had to protect. Ivy was. After Nora died, Craig moved in close, and at the time, I was grateful for it. God help me. He started coming by the house 2 or 3 times a week, checking on me, and Denise would send food, and I was a broken old man alone in a too quiet house, and I let the warmth of it in like a man half frozen letting in a fire, without ever asking why the fire had shown up now, after years of being banked so low. The campaign started gently, the way these things always do, dressed up as love. Dad, this big old house is too much for one person. It's true, it was a big house, and it was quiet, and it hurt to be in it. Dad, all these stairs, at your age, with nobody here if you fell. Dad, you're rattling around in all this empty space, spending money to heat rooms nobody's in, and for what? And then the refrain, the one they came back to again and again, in Craig's reasonable voice and Denise's warmer, softer one. Sell the empty house and come live with us. You'd have family around. You wouldn't be alone. It'd be so much cheaper, Dad. Pool everything, one household instead of 2. It just makes sense. And it's what Mom would have wanted, for us all to be together. That last one was the one that got under my guard. It's what Mom would have wanted. They used Nora on me. They used her memory as the lever to pry me out of the house she and I had made, and I was too deep in missing her to see the hand on the lever. I remember the evening it turned, the evening I actually decided to sell, because they engineered it, though I didn't see the engineering until much later. Craig and Denise had me over for dinner. This was before I moved in, when I still had my house, and they'd invited Ivy, and they'd made it warm, and after dinner, Denise brought out a photo album, Nora's old albums that she'd somehow gotten from my house, and we sat and looked at pictures of Nora, and everyone got tearful, and it was the closest I'd felt to my family since the funeral. And then, right in the soft middle of all that feeling, Craig said gently, like it was just occurring to him, "You know what Mom would hate? Thinking of you alone in that big house, rattling around, all these memories and nobody to share them with. She'd want you here, Dad, with us, with Ivy, where you're not alone." And Denise squeezed my hand, and Ivy, who didn't know she was being used as a prop, smiled at me hopefully. And I sat there with my dead wife's photographs in my lap, and my grief wide open, and my whole family telling me the loving thing, the Nora thing, was to sell up and come be with them. I said yes that night, not out loud, but in my heart I said yes, and the rest was just paperwork. It was a beautiful piece of work that evening. I have to give them that, looking back. They didn't push. They opened me up with Nora and Ivy and old photographs until I pushed myself. That's the craft of it. The good ones never have to force the lock. They get you to open it from the inside and hand them the key and thank them and think it was your own idea. I know all their moves now. I teach them at the foundation to people trying to protect their own parents. And every time I describe that evening with the photo album, I watch some son or daughter go pale because they've just recognized an evening of their own. I want to be fair, even now, even after everything, because I was a fool, but I wasn't only a fool. There was a real thing they were preying on, and it's worth naming because some of you listening are being preyed on by the same real thing right now. I was lonely. I was frightened of the quiet. The house did hurt. And a lonely, frightened old man in a house that hurts will talk himself into almost anything if the people he loves keep gently telling him it's the smart thing, the safe thing, the loving thing. That's the machine. It doesn't run on cruelty. It runs on your own loneliness, turned against you by people who've noticed it and priced it. So I did it. I sold the house. I sold the house Nora and I had raised our children in. The house I'd wired and locked and loved for 40 years. The house that still smelled like her in the closets. I sold it to a nice young couple who I'm sure are very happy there, and I signed the papers with a hand that wanted to shake, and I took the money. And it was a good deal of money, that house, paid off and in a good neighborhood, more than a couple $100,000 free and clear. And I moved into the back bedroom of my son's house. My son's house. That's what everyone called it. That's what I called it then, before I let myself remember whose name was really on the deed. And here is the thing that saved me, the thing I did almost without thinking, out of 50 years of habit and one iron rule in Nora's voice. When that house money came in, everybody had a plan for it. Craig wanted to put it somewhere. It'll work for you, Dad. I know some people. Denise talked about a joint household account, just so the bills are simple, so you're not writing checks all the time, so we can take care of you. Brad, I'll tell you about Brad, had vehicles for it. Everyone had a handout, gently, helpfully, for the $200 and some thousand from the sale of my home. And some old part of me, the part that still had Nora's hand on the back of its neck, would not do it. I heard her, plain as if she were in the room. You keep your name on the papers, Raymond. So I smiled and I nodded and I said I'd think about the joint account. I'd look into Brad's vehicles. I just wanted to take my time. I was a slow old man these days. And instead, the very first week, I did a quiet thing. I told them I was going out to get my eyes checked, because a foggy old man is always getting his eyes checked, and I drove clear across town to a bank where Craig didn't know a soul, a bank Nora and I had used decades ago, and I sat down with a manager I'd never met, and I opened accounts in my name alone, mine and no one else's, and I moved the house money, every dollar of it, out of the sale account they were all circling, and into those new accounts, tied to nothing, reachable by nobody but me. It took an afternoon. I signed my name, my plain, ordinary signature, the one Nora always told me to keep plain, so nobody can ever say it's fancy enough to be worth forging, and so you'll always know your own hand. And I drove home, and I said nothing, and I let all of them go on believing the money was still in the corral, fattening, waiting for the gate to open with my signature. They thought they had $200,000 cornered. I'd walked it out the back the first week and shut the door soft behind me. That was Nora, still keeping the books. 2 years in the ground, and I did one more thing, out of the same habit. When I moved, I brought my old floor safe from the shop. A good safe, one of the best I ever installed, and I set it up in the corner of that garage bedroom workshop they let me have, and I bolted it to the slab myself, and I put the important things in it. The originals. Nora's trust documents, the deed to Craig's house, the real one, with our name on it. My will. The bank books for the accounts they didn't know about. My whole life, locked in a safe that I built, whose combination lived in exactly one place on this earth, which is the inside of my own head. A locksmith learns young. There is no lock a determined man can't eventually open, except one whose only key is a thing you never wrote down and never told a soul. That safe, in the corner of the room I paid rent for, held everything they wanted, 6 feet from where they thought they'd finally cornered a helpless old man. And none of them could open it, and none of them ever knew it was the reason they were going to lose. The rent came about 2 months after I moved in. I've told you how it went. The envelope, the invoice, the reasonable voice, the check I wrote the next morning. But I haven't told you why it mattered so much, why a rent invoice from your own child lands so much harder than the dollar amount on it. It's because it's not really about the money. It never is with these things. Charging me rent was Craig and Denise establishing a fact out loud on paper, for the record, that I was a tenant, a guest, a boarder, not the man whose money bought the house, not the father, not the founder of anything, a line item. They needed me to accept, in writing, that my place in that family was now something I paid for monthly and could be evicted from. It was the first tumbler, if you like. It was them testing whether the lock would turn, and when I paid it, meek as milk, they felt it click, and they smiled at each other, and they reach for the next one. They should have wondered why the lock turned so easy. A lock that turns too easy is a lock that's been left open on purpose. Living there, those first months, was a slow education in how small a person can be made to feel in increments. No single thing was big enough to point at. That's the craft of it. It was the thermostat I wasn't allowed to touch, and the meals where the conversation went around me like I was furniture, and the way Denise would introduce me to her friends as Craig's father, he's staying with us, staying like weather. It was my workbench in the garage getting crowded out month by month by their boxes and their junk until I had a corner. It was being asked gently not to use the front room when they had company because I made the company uncomfortable. An old man in a chair. It was Craig taking my truck keys to get it serviced, and the truck not coming back, sold, I found out later, and the money never quite reaching me. It was 1,000 small filings, each one taking off a little more, until one day you look up and you're a boarder in your son's house, apologizing for existing, and you can't quite remember how you got there. There's one dinner I think about. Denise's parents were visiting, and a couple of her friends, and it was the closest thing to a real family evening I'd had since Nora, and I was so grateful for it I could have wept, which tells you how low I'd sunk. And somewhere in the meal, Denise's mother, being kind, asked me a question about my life, what I'd done for a living all those years. And I started to tell her. I started to tell her about the shop, and the trade, and the ice storm, and I saw Ivy at the far end of the table lean in a little because she loved those stories. And Craig cut me off, smooth, easy, the way he did everything. "Dad did locks," he said to the table, with a little laugh. "Fix people's locks. He's earned his rest now. We take care of him. Fix people's locks. 50 years. The vaults, the banks, the businesses that trusted Ferris with the keys to everything they had. The young men I'd trained who ran their own shops now. And my son summed it up for a table of strangers as fixed people's locks, and then talked over me to change the subject. And the moment passed, and Denise's mother gave me that soft pat of a smile, and I sat there and ate my dinner and said nothing. It's such a small thing. That's the craft of it. None of it is ever big enough to point at. But I felt myself disappear a little more at that table, felt the last of the man I'd been filed down another notch, and I saw Ivy see it happen, and I saw her look down at her plate, ashamed for me and unable to do a thing, 16 years old. That's the one that still gets me, not the rent. The look on my granddaughter's face when they made me small in front of company, and she couldn't stop it, and neither could I. And I let it happen. That's what I need you to understand, because if you're waiting for me on the far side of this, I need you to know that I earned my way there through a stretch of being exactly as small as they wanted. I let it happen partly out of grief and partly out of a fool's hope that if I were good enough, quiet enough, no trouble at all, then maybe the warmth I'd felt at the start would come back and be real this time. That's the cruelest hope there is, and they fed it to me in little doses to keep me pliable, a kind word here, a family dinner there, just enough to keep the old dog hoping. I have forgiven myself for that hope mostly. A man who's just lost his wife of 46 years is allowed to hope his children love him. The shame isn't on the one who hopes. It's on the ones who use the hope. The night everything changed, I couldn't sleep. That was nothing new. I slept badly in that house, in that narrow bed, in that room that wasn't mine. It was late, past midnight, and I got up for a glass of water, and I didn't turn the hall light on because I knew the house by feel, the way I know a lock by feel. And as I came quiet down the hall in my socks, I realized Craig and Denise were still up, in the kitchen, talking low, and the sound of it was carrying up through the old floor register, the way sound does in these houses, the heating vent that runs between the kitchen and the hall, carrying their voices to me, clear as if I were standing at the table. I should have kept walking. I want you to know I didn't set out to eavesdrop on my own son. But I heard my own name, and a man will stop for that. And I stopped, and I stood there in the dark hallway in my socks, and I listened to my children talk about me when they thought I couldn't hear. And it is the coldest thing I have ever stood through in my life, colder than the ice storm, colder than the morning Nora's side of the bed was empty. "Can't take much more of it," Denise was saying. "He's underfoot constantly. It was supposed to be temporary. You said once we got the house money sorted and the papers signed, we'd move him along." "We will," Craig said. "It's the money that's slow, not the plan. Once he signs the power of attorney and the joint account, and Brad gets the house refinanced, we're clear. We put him in Maple Court. It's nice, it's expensive. We use his own money to pay for it. Everybody wins. He'll be looked after. He'll be fine. He should be paying for himself already. The rent barely covers. The rent isn't about the money, Denise. We've been over this. The rent's about him getting used to the idea that this is a transaction, that he's a cost. It softens him up for Maple Court. You can't move a man to a home if he still thinks he's the head of the family. You move him there once he already thinks of himself as a boarder who's become a burden. Then he goes quietly. Then he's grateful even. A pause, a chair creaking. Honestly, the hardest part's been the house. I cannot get this refinance to close. Every title company I take it to comes back with the same garbage about a cloud on the title, some trust nonsense, and I don't have time to chase down 40-year-old paperwork. It's my house. I've lived here 15 years, but the money's locked up in it until I can clear the title, and I need that money, Denise. I've got Brad breathing down my neck, and the cards are, then get the old man to sign whatever clears it. He'll sign anything. Look how he took the rent. He just wants us to love him, put a paper in front of him and tell him it's to help you, and he'll sign his own name off the planet. And then Craig laughed. My son laughed low in his kitchen at midnight and said the thing I will carry to my grave. He said, "Yeah, poor old bastard. He really would. You know the worst part? He thinks he's finally part of the family in here. He thinks this is us taking care of him." And Denise made a sound that was almost a laugh too. And one of them got up to rinse a glass, and I turned and I went back down that dark hall to my narrow bed, and I sat on the edge of it, and I did not cry, and I did not sleep. I want to tell you what those hours were like, sitting on the edge of that bed in the dark, because I think they're the truest hours in this whole story, and maybe the most important. Because for the first hour, I'll be honest with you, I wanted to die. That's the plain truth of it, and I won't dress it up, because some of you know exactly that hour. I sat there, and I felt the whole weight of it, that my son, my boy, the one I carried on my shoulders through the shop, thought of me as a poor old bastard to be softened up and filed away, thought my love for my family was a joke, thought the warmth I'd been so pathetically grateful for was just grease to make me slide easier toward a home. And I felt, for that first hour, that there was nothing left, that Nora was gone, and now my son was gone too, in a way worse than gone, and that I was just a foolish old man in a rented room who'd outlived everything that made him worth anything. That hour was the closest I have come, in 75 years, to giving up entirely. And then, somewhere in the second hour, sitting in that dark, a different thing started to happen. The grief didn't lift exactly, but underneath it, cold and slow, the old thing woke up, the locksmith. The man who'd sat on the floor of 10,000 jobs in front of 10,000 locks that swore they'd never open, and opened them because he was patient and his hands were steady and he was willing to be underestimated for as long as it took. And that man looked at the situation the way he'd look at a lock, without feeling, just assessing. Where are the pins? How is it built? Where does it give? And he started very quietly to work. And here is the thing I understood, sitting there as the windows started to go gray. They had made one mistake, the mistake that beats men like my son every single time. They had gotten impatient. They'd shown their hand at midnight in a kitchen over a heating vent to a man they were sure was asleep and beaten. They'd told me the whole plan. And a man who knows the whole plan and has all the time in the world and holds a key nobody knows about, that man is not beaten. That man is just getting started. By the time the sun came up, gray and cold over that house, I wasn't grieving anymore. I was working. And somewhere in those hours before dawn, the old locksmith woke all the way up and started to feel for the tumblers. I want to tell you what I did with what I'd heard, because a lesser man, a younger man, the man I used to be before 50 years of locks taught me patience, would have gone straight into that kitchen the next morning and had it out. And that is exactly what would have lost me everything. If I'd confronted them, they'd have known I was awake, and they'd have circled the wagons, and they'd have moved faster and quieter, and a foggy old man's word about a midnight conversation he thinks he heard through a heating vent is worth precisely nothing against a smooth son and a warm daughter-in-law who've spent a year telling everyone that poor dad gets confused. No, I'd learned the first rule of my trade before I learned any other. When a lock doesn't want to open, you don't force it. You go quiet, and you feel, and you find out exactly how it's built before you touch a single pin. So, the next morning, I came to breakfast exactly the same small, grateful, foggy old man I'd been the morning before. I said good morning. I asked if there was more coffee. I let Denise talk over me. I told Craig his truck ran nice now, thanks for taking care of the servicing, even knowing he'd sold it. I became, from that morning on, the most convincing performance of a beaten old man you ever saw, because now I had a reason to be beaten, and a reason is what makes a performance real. And inside, behind that soft, foolish face, I was cold and clear and moving, feeling for every tumbler in the machine they'd built around me. That afternoon, I told them I was going to the library because the old man liked the quiet of the library, and instead, I drove across town and I made a phone call I should have made a year before. I called Saul Weinstein. Saul had been my lawyer and my friend for over 40 years. He'd drawn up the papers when we bought Craig's house. He'd set up Nora's trust. He knew where every legal bone in my life was buried because he'd helped me bury most of them. I drifted from Saul after Nora died, the way I drifted from everything, and Craig had been only too happy to fill the space with his own people, with Brad and with a young lawyer I didn't know. Calling Saul again was like finding a key in an old coat you were about to give away. That little jolt of, I still have this. I sat in my truck in the library parking lot, and I told him everything in order, the way Nora taught me to lay out anything that mattered. The move-in, the rent, the joint account they wanted, the power of attorney, Brad and his vehicles, and the conversation through the vent. The refinance that wouldn't close, the cloud on the title, Maple Court, all of it. Saul was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, in a voice that had gone very slow and very careful, "Ray, do you remember what's in Nora's trust?" "Course I do," I said. "Our house money, back when we had the house. Some investments and I stopped, because I heard it the same moment he said it. "And the deed to Craig's house," Saul said softly. "Ray, listen to me. Craig can't refinance that house. He can't sell it. He can't borrow a dime against it. Not because of some paperwork glitch. Because it isn't his. The deed to the house your son is charging you rent to live in is sitting in Nora's trust with your name on it, exactly where the two of you put it 15 years ago. That's the cloud on the title his title company keeps choking on. It's you. You are the cloud on the title. Your son has spent months trying to pull money out of a house he doesn't own, and hitting a wall he can't understand, and the wall is you, and he has no idea. Ray, do you understand what you're holding?" I sat in that truck in the library lot, and I felt it, tumbler by tumbler, the whole thing turning over in the dark. My son was charging me rent to live in a house I owned. My son was trying to refinance a house I owned, to pull out cash I'd paid for, to pay off debts I'd never made, and then use my own money to lock me away in Maple Court once I'd signed him the last papers he needed. And the one thing standing between him and all of it, the one lock he couldn't pick, the one door he couldn't get behind, was a deed in a trust that his own mother had set up 15 years ago because she'd looked at her own family and known that a day like this might come. Nora built me a fortress before she died and never told me it was a fortress. She just called it keeping your name on the papers. And now, 2 years in her grave, she'd handed me the only key. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment after that landed, and Saul let me sit, 40 years of friendship in his silence. And then something happened that I wasn't expecting. I started to laugh. Not a happy laugh, a low, cracked, disbelieving laugh. The laugh of a man who's been drowning for 2 years and just felt his foot touch the bottom. Because the whole grinding weight of it, the year of being small, the rent, the vent, the poor old bastard, all of it had been built on a lie that a single old document quietly exposed. They'd spent a year and a half, and God knows how much cruelty trying to take a house that had never been theirs to take. And every single day of that year, the deed to it had been sitting in a safe 40 feet from where they plotted, with my name on it, waiting. It was almost funny. It was the blackest kind of funny there is. And Saul, hearing me laugh, laughed too. And then he got quiet again and said, "Okay, Ray, get it out of your system, because now we go to work, and from here on, you don't laugh where they can see you. From here on, you're the beaten old man, right up until the day you're not." And I wiped my eyes, and I said, "Saul, I've been a beaten old man for 2 years. I can do it a few more months. It's the not beaten part I forgot how to do. Remind me how that goes." And that's what he did. He reminded me. Right there on the phone, 40 years of friendship in his voice, Saul Weinstein reminded me how a man who isn't beaten does things. "All right," I said finally, and I could hear my own voice change, could hear the fog burn off it, could hear the man Nora married come back into it after 2 years gone. "Here's what we're gonna do. and we're going to do it slow and quiet, and we're going to do it right, because I don't want to just stop them. I want the whole thing, the money, the plan, all of it, laid out on a table in daylight, where nobody can call it a confused old man's imagination. I've spent 50 years knowing how to open things. I'd like your help opening this one all the way up." And Saul Weinstein, 40 years my friend, let out a low sound that was half a laugh and half something older and harder, and he said, "Ray, I have been waiting 2 years for you to call me and sound like yourself again. Let's build it right. Don't sign anything. Don't tip your hand. Keep being exactly the beaten old man he's counting on, and come see me tomorrow and bring me everything in that safe." Over the next several weeks, I did 2 things at once, and doing them at once was the hardest thing I've done since I buried Nora. On the outside, I became more beaten, more pliable, more ready to sign than I'd ever been. I fed my son exactly the surrender he was hungry for. And on the inside, with Sewell, I assembled the crew to take him apart. But first, I ran a test, because before I built anything, I needed to be certain, dead certain, not vent in the dark certain, of what my son was. So one evening after dinner, I gave Craig the smallest taste of what he wanted. I sighed, and I said in my tiredest voice that I'd been thinking and that he was probably right, that a man my age shouldn't be trying to manage his own affairs, that maybe it was time I let him handle the money and the paperwork so I could stop worrying about it. And I watched my son's whole face open like a door. "Dad," he said, warm as I'd heard him since Nora died, "I think that's really wise. I really do. That's a load off, letting family carry it. Tell you what, Brad and I have got some paperwork mostly ready, just some financial power of attorney, and a thing to clean up the title on the house so it's all tidy. Nothing you need to worry about. I'll bring it home this week. It's real technical, Dad, so don't wear your eyes out on it. I'll just walk you through where to sign, and we'll knock it out in 10 minutes, and it'll all be handled. Don't wear your eyes out on it. I'll show you where to sign." There it was, in my son's own warm voice. A power of attorney to take my money, and a thing to clean up the title. A quit-claim deed, I'd learn, that would sign the house out of Nora's trust and into his hands, the exact key he'd been missing, and an invitation to sign both without reading them. 50 years I held other men's keys and never once misused the trust, and here was my own son telling me not to trouble my eyes. Just sign. Trust me. I have learned exactly one thing about that sentence in 75 years, and it has never failed me. An honest man begs you to read every line and reads it to you himself. A man who tells you not to bother your eyes wants your hand on the pen and your mind switched off. I had my answer, complete, and it set something in me hard as a poured slab. "That sounds fine, son," I said softly, giving him the beaten old man he wanted so badly. "Whenever you've got it ready. No rush. My eyes aren't what they were." And he told me he loved me. He'd started saying that again lately, now that I was being useful. And I said it back, and I went out to the garage and sat by my safe in the dark for a while. Because a man is allowed a few minutes to grieve the son he thought he had, even while he's getting ready to stop the son he actually has. Then I built the crew. Sewell brought in a forensic accountant, a sharp, unsmiling young woman named Priya Desai, who did this kind of work for courts and knew how to make a bank statement confess. My old company accountant, Manny Rosales, who'd kept the books for Ferris Lock for 30 years and loved Nora almost as much as I did, came out of semi-retirement the second I called him, furious on my behalf before I'd finished the first sentence. When I told Manny what Craig was doing, there was a silence on the phone, and then Manny said, in a voice I'd never heard from that gentle man in 30 years, "Ray, I did the books next to Nora Ferris for 3 decades. I sat at that kitchen table with her doing payroll, and you're telling me her own boy is charging you rent and forging your name?" And then he said something I won't forget. "You get me every scrap of paper you can find. Because I'll tell you what, Nora's not here to protect you anymore, so the people who loved her are going to have to do it for her, starting with me." He dug up every old record we had, 30 years of it. The original trust papers, the closing documents from when we bought Craig's house, the account histories, the deep paper that let Priya and Sandy prove not just what Craig had done, but that the house had been mine and in the trust from the very first day, clean, documented, unarguable. Manny wept when he found the closing file on Craig's house, the one with Nora's signature on it next to mine from 15 years before. He said it in front of me and put his finger on her name and couldn't say anything for a minute. Then he said, "She knew, Ray. Look." She knew back then. And I looked at Nora's plain, clear signature, 15 years old, on the document that was going to save my life, and I had to agree. She knew. And Sewell brought in one more, on the recommendation of a judge he trusted, an investigator named Sandy Kirk, a retired detective who'd spent 15 years working financial crimes against the elderly before she went private. Sandy Kirk had flat, patient eyes and a way of asking a question and then just waiting, not filling the silence, until you did, which I imagine is how she'd gotten a great many people to tell her a great many things they shouldn't have. The first time Sandy and I sat down in Sewell's office with the blinds drawn, I told her I wanted all of it. The money, Brad, the plan, the whole machine, and I slid a check across the table with the amount left blank. She looked at it, folded it once, put it in her jacket without writing a number, and said, "Mr. Ferris, before I take a dime, I'll be straight with you, because you strike me as a man who'd rather have it straight. When a stranger does this to somebody, it's a case. I work it, I close it, I sleep fine. When it's your own kid, it's a different animal, and winning doesn't make it stop hurting. I've watched tough old birds come apart at the end of one of these, right when they ought to be celebrating, because what we dug up was worse than not knowing. So I've got to ask you before we start, are you sure you want to see all of it, everything he's done?" I thought about the vent and the laugh and poor old bastard, and I thought about Nora setting up that trust 15 years ago with her finger tapping the table, and I thought about Ivy at my bench with her tongue between her teeth. And I said, "Ms. Kirk, my son slid me a bill for rent in a house I own and told his wife it was to soften me up for a home. I've spent 50 years opening things other people swore couldn't be opened, and looking at what's really inside. No, I'm not afraid of what's inside my own son. Open it all the way up." She nodded slowly, and something behind those flat eyes went sharp, and she said, "Then give me a few weeks, and Mr. Ferris, keep being the beaten old man. It's the best lockpick you've got." There was one thing I gave Sandy that she said made her whole job easier, and it's the kind of thing only a locksmith would have thought of, or had. Years ago, when Craig and Denise moved into that house, I'd given them a housewarming gift. I'd wired the whole place myself, the good system, the locks and the cameras and the alarm, the same commercial-grade equipment I put on banks, because that's what a man in my trade gives his kid, security. And I'd set it up and maintained it, and I was the one on the account, the administrator, because Craig never wanted to be bothered with the technical side of anything. 15 years later, nobody had ever thought to change that. Why would they? It was just the alarm system, but that system had ears and eyes and a memory, and the man with the administrator's key to all of it was me. Craig had spent months plotting against his father at a kitchen table in a house his father had wired for sound, monitored by a system his father still controlled, never once remembering that the quiet old boarder in the back room had built the very nerves of the house around him. When I told Sandy that, she sat back in her chair and looked at me for a long moment, and then she laughed, a short, dry laugh, and she said, "Mr. Ferris, in 15 years I have never once had a victim who owned the surveillance in the house where the crime was being planned. Your son didn't just underestimate you. He plotted against a locksmith inside a locksmith's own trap and called it his living room." I didn't laugh, but I'll admit that somewhere down deep in the cold, clear place, something that had been broken for 2 years felt for just a second almost like itself again. And I did keep being the beaten old man all through that long winter and into spring, and I'll tell you plainly, it was the hardest thing in this whole story. Do you know what it costs a proud man to sit at a table and be talked over, and let himself be talked over, while the truth sits in his shirt pocket like a live coal? To have your son slide you a rent check reminder and say thank you softly, when what you want is to stand up and tell that whole kitchen exactly who owns the floor they're standing on. To let a granddaughter you love watch you be made small and not be able to tell her yet why you're letting it happen. I bit through my own pride 100 times that winter. But every single time I wanted to break, to snap, to be the man I'd been for 50 years, I heard Nora, slow and steady and together. And I thought about 6 weeks or 6 months of swallowed pride against the rest of Ivy's life and the whole of my own dignity. And I kept my face soft and my voice small. There's a thing the trade teaches you about patience that most people never learn, and it's the thing that carried me through that winter. When you're working a hard lock, a good one, a stubborn one, the temptation the whole time is to force it. Your knuckles ache, your back aches, the thing won't give, and every instinct in your body says push harder, torque you it, break it open. And forcing is exactly what fails. Force snaps your pick off in the keyway and jams the whole mechanism and tells the lock you're coming. The only thing that ever works is the opposite of force. You back off the tension, you go soft, you go slow, you feel for one pin at a time, and you wait. You wait for each one to set with that tiny click that lives more in your fingertips than in your ears. It can take an hour, it can take longer, and the whole time you have to stay soft and patient and willing to be beaten by a piece of brass for as long as it takes to not be. 50 years of that is a strange education for a man. It teaches you that the thing that looks like weakness, the softness, the patience, the willingness to sit there and take it and not force anything, is actually the only strength that ever opens the hard locks. My son had force. He had pressure and threats and hurry and Brad breathing down his neck. I had patience. I'd spent 50 years learning to be soft against something that wouldn't give and to trust that the pins were setting even when nothing seemed to be happening. So all that winter I stayed soft and I let them push and I felt each little tumbler set. A dated withdrawal here, a recorded conversation there, a document, a lie, a date that couldn't be right. Click, 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 none of them knowing I could feel it, all of them sure the old lock was jammed for good. Because a proud man who defends himself too soon loses every time. It's the patient man who wins. It's the man who can stand to be underestimated for exactly as long as the job takes. And being underestimated has never frightened me. It's the ground I built everything on. The young fellow on the bicycle the bankers laughed at. The locksmith the suits thought was a rube. I let my son underestimate me right up to the last tumbler. It was the most expensive performance of my life, and it bought me everything. It took Priya Desai and Manny Rosales and Sandy Kirk the better part of 2 months to lay the machine out flat. And when they finally did, on a Saturday in Seoul's conference room with the blinds drawn, it covered the whole long table. I'll walk you through it the way they walked me through it. In layers, each one worse than the one before, because that's how betrayal actually shows itself. Not all at once, but a floor at a time, each one dropping you further than you thought there was room to fall. The first layer was the money, and it was theft, plain and cold, wearing the coat of helping Dad manage things. Now, thanks to Nora, they'd never gotten their hands on the big prize, the 200-odd thousand from the sale of my house, which I'd quietly walked out the back door to a bank across town the first week, and which sat safe in my name alone the whole time they thought it was corralled and waiting. That was the one they were really hunting, and they never once touched it. And the not touching drove Craig quietly frantic, which was half the reason he kept pushing the joint account and the power of attorney. But the money they could reach, they'd been bleeding steadily. There was the rent, of course. Rent I paid into an account Craig controlled. There were the household expenses and Dad's share that Denise itemized and that always ran high and never quite added up. There was my truck, sold, the money for it never reaching me. There were small withdrawals and transfers Craig had managed to make from an old account of mine he'd gotten signing authority on to pay my bills for me in the fog right after Nora died. An authority I'd forgotten I'd given in that first terrible month, when I'd have signed anything to make the world stop for a minute. Priya had it all traced, dated, itemized. It wasn't the fortune they were after, but it was theft, steady and deliberate, dollar by dollar, from a grieving old man by the son who was supposed to be taking care of him, and laid out flat on that table. It was a sickening thing to look at. She walked me through it line by line, and one line is the one that stuck. The truck. My truck. A good work truck I'd had for years, that Craig had taken to get serviced, and that never came back. Priya turned a page, and there it was. The sale, the amount, the date, the money landing in an account of Craig's and never once in any form reaching me. And she said gently, "Did he ever give you anything for it? Even tell you it sold?" And I said no. He told me it was still in the shop, waiting on a part. For months he told me my own truck was waiting on a part, while the money for it sat in his account. Such a small thing, next to a house and $200,000. But that's the one that made my hands go still on the table, because I could suddenly see all of it in that one line, the ease of it, the smallness of it, the way my son could look me in the eye and tell me my truck was waiting on a part and feel nothing at all. A man who'll do that over a truck will do anything over a house. The little lie tells you everything about the big one. And then Priya turned to the dates, and her voice got a little careful, the way a decent person's voice gets when they're about to hand you something that's going to hurt no matter how gently they set it down. Because the small withdrawals, the first ones, the very first testing of the waters on that old account, they didn't start after Nora died. They started before. They started the week of Nora's diagnosis, that Tuesday. That small room with the diagram of the failing heart on the wall, the day the doctor used the word progressive, and I held Nora's hand under the table so I wouldn't come apart in front of a stranger. That same week, while I was learning to count my wife's breaths and dreading the day I'd run out of them, my son had looked at his mother's death sentence and seen a starting gun. He'd started moving money that week, small, careful, testing. While his mother was dying and his father was breaking, my son was checking to see how much he could take and whether anyone would notice. There is a cold in a man that runs deeper than any hatred, and I was looking at the proof of it on a table, dated in Priya Desai's neat hand, and it aged me a decade in an afternoon. I sat with that a long while. Nobody in that room said anything. They let me sit with it. And when I could talk again, I said, "All right, that's the money." But the money was never really the point for them, was it? Show me the house. Show me what they were trying to do with the house I own. And Sandy Kirk, quiet in the corner, the way she got quiet, leaned forward and opened a second folder and said, "That's where it gets serious, Mr. Ferris, because they weren't just trying to clear the title. They lined up what to do the second they had it. The second layer was the house, my house, the one they lived in and charged me rent for. And it was here that the thing stopped being simple greed and became a plan, a patient, ugly, step-by-step plan to strip me of everything and file me away. Sandy laid it out in order. Craig was in trouble. Real trouble, the kind that doesn't show from the road. The nice car, the watch, the house that looked like success. It was all built on debt, layers of it, and the market had turned and the mortgage business had gotten lean, and Craig had kept spending like a man who couldn't afford to be seen slowing down. He owed money everywhere, and he owed it, most dangerously, to Brad Coyle. Sandy had run Brad down, and Brad was no financial advisor. Whatever business card he handed Denise's friends. Brad was the kind of man who lends money to people like Craig at terms that aren't quite legal and collects in ways that aren't quite either, and who'd figured out years ago that the real money isn't in lending to desperate men. It's in helping desperate men strip the assets off their own aging parents. Brad specialized in it. He had a whole soft-spoken playbook, the joint accounts, the powers of attorney, the elder transition consulting, the friendly tour of the nice facility, the paperwork drawn up to look like love. Brad was the one who'd taught Craig and Denise the script. Brad was the engine under the whole machine, and Brad was into Craig deep, and Brad wanted to get paid, and the way Brad was going to get paid was out of me. The plan had 3 moves, and Sandy had documented all 3. Move 1, get me to sign a financial power of attorney, handing Craig legal control of my money, including, they assumed, the $200,000 from the house sale that they still thought was sitting in the corral. Move 2, get me to sign the quitclaim deed, the little thing to clean up the title, which would carry the house out of Nora's trust and into Craig's name, at which point Craig could finally refinance it, pull out the equity I had paid for, cash for the house 15 years ago, and hand a fat slice of it to Brad and keep the rest. Move 3, once the money and the house were secured, Maple Court, the nice, expensive facility. They'd already toured it. Sandy had the record of the visit. They were going to use my own money to pay to put me somewhere out of the way, and they were going to do it wrapped in the language of care. He needs more support than we can give him. It's the loving choice. It's what's best for Dad. The exact language that has been used to disappear more old people than any of us will ever know. 3 moves, my money, my house, and me. And the whole thing hinged, every bit of it, on getting my signature on 2 pieces of paper. That's all they needed. 2 signatures from a man they'd spent a year and a half convincing everyone was too foggy to be trusted with his own affairs. Foggy enough to sign, not foggy enough to be believed if he ever complained. And here's the beautiful thing. The thing I turned over in my hands in that conference room, like a key I'd cut 50 years ago and just found in an old coat. The entire plan was impossible. Every move of it depended on things that could not happen. The power of attorney couldn't reach the house money because the house money wasn't where they thought. It was across town in my name alone, thanks to Nora. The quitclaim couldn't clear the title because you can't quitclaim a house out of a trust you don't control, and I controlled the trust, not Craig. And Sewell would no more let that document stand than he'd let the sun rise in the west. And Maple Court couldn't be paid for with money they'd never actually get. My son had built a 3-move plan to take everything I had, and not one of the 3 moves could physically be completed. And the reason was that a woman 2 years dead had sat me down at a kitchen table 15 years ago and made me keep my name on the papers. He'd been pushing on a locked door for months, harder and harder, growing more frantic, more careless, more cruel. The rent, the pressure, the whispering to everyone that I was slipping, never once understanding that the door wasn't stuck, it was locked. And a locksmith held the only key. But Sandy wasn't finished, and the last thing she put on the table was the one that took the air out of the room, and it was the thing that turned a lawsuit into a criminal case. Because Craig and Brad, growing impatient with an old man who kept not quite signing, had decided to stop waiting. Sandy had gotten it 3 ways, from Brad's own too talkative associate, from a paper trail, and from a document itself. They had prepared to forge my signature. There was a version of the quitclaim deed, sitting ready with a signature line where a witness and a compliant notary, Brad, kept in his pocket, were prepared to swear that old Ray Ferris had signed it, whether old Ray Ferris ever picked up a pen or not. They were done asking. They were going to take the house out of Nora's trust with a forged signature and a bought notary, and dare the confused old man to prove otherwise. And that, the forgery, the false notarization, the conspiracy to steal a house through fraud, that isn't a family disagreement you settle over the holidays. That's a stack of felonies with real names, and Sandy Kirk, 15 years on financial crimes against the elderly, laid them out for me one by one, and then she said, "Mr. Ferris, this stopped being just about getting your money back. This is a crime, several, and I think it's time we brought in some people who carry badges." There was one more thing Sandy found, and she brought it to me alone, without the others, because she was a decent woman, and she understood that some things need to land in private. It was about my daughter, about Kate, and about the reason Kate had drifted so far, so fast after Nora died. It hadn't been distance, it hadn't been life, or her own family, or a daughter simply far away. Sandy had talked to people, to Manny, to a couple of Nora's old friends, to a cousin, and a picture had come clear. In the months after Nora's death, when Kate had wanted to be here, wanted to come stay, wanted to help sort out my affairs and be part of taking care of me, Craig had headed her off, quietly, reasonably, the way he did everything. He'd told Kate that Dad was fragile, that too many people around overwhelmed me, that I got confused and upset with visitors, that it was better, kinder, if she kept her distance and let Craig, who was right here, handle things. And he'd told me, in the same reasonable voice, a matching set of small lies about Kate, that she was busy, that she'd said she couldn't get away, that she'd rather I not call and bother her at work, that she was leaving it all to Craig because that was easier for her. He'd sat between us, my son, and told each of us a version of the other that kept us apart, kept Kate 3 states away and in the dark, kept the one person in this family with a paralegal's eyes and her mother's spine out of the room where the machine was being built, because Kate would have seen it. Kate would have read the documents. Kate would have caught it in a week. So Craig kept her away, on purpose, with lies, the same as he kept me foggy and small, and for the same reason. Because the plan couldn't survive being looked at by anyone who loved me and wasn't afraid to look. I called Kate that night. It was the hardest call I've made since the one to the funeral home, and harder in one way, because that call was about a loss already finished, and this one might tell me I'd lost my daughter too, and by my own foolishness. She picked up wary, that careful, braced tone we'd both fallen into. And I didn't give her the speech I'd rehearsed. I just told her the truth. I said, "Katie, I've been told for 2 years that you didn't want to be bothered with me, and I let myself believe it, because I was grieving and it was easier than fighting for you, and that was wrong of me, and I'm sorry. I've found out it wasn't true. Your brother told me one thing and told you another, and kept us apart on purpose, because he had things going on he couldn't let you see. You were kept away, sweetheart. You didn't abandon me. You were lied out of the room. And I called because I needed you to hear me say it before anything else. I know now, and that I'm sorry I ever doubted you, and that I need my daughter." There was a silence on the line so long I thought she'd hung up. And then my Kate started to cry. Not the crying of someone wronged, but the deeper kind. The kind of someone who's been carrying a hurt for 2 years and just had it lifted. "I thought you didn't want me," she said. "He told me you got agitated when I called. I stopped calling because I thought I was hurting you. Dad, I thought I was staying away for your sake." And that broke something loose in both of us, and we cried together, 3 states apart, my paralegal daughter and me, and it was the true beginning of the mending. And then, because she is Nora's daughter to the bone, she wiped her face and her voice changed and she said, "Okay, tell me everything, from the beginning. And Dad, did you keep the paperwork? Please tell me you kept the paperwork." I told her about the safe and about Soul and about Priya and Sandy and the deed in Nora's trust. And I heard my daughter, 2 years lost and 1 phone call found, start to lay it all out in her head with the cold, clean fury of someone who reads the fine print for a living. And I thought, they should never have let this one out of the room. And she earned that thought within the week. Once she was home and Soul had let her sit with the documents, she's a paralegal, she signed everything the lawyers needed so it was all proper. Kate did in 3 evenings what it might have taken the rest of us a month to do, because she reads legal paper the way I read a lock, by feel for the place where it's wrong. She was the one who caught the thing in the quitclaim that made it not just fraud, but a particular, prosecutable kind of fraud, a detail in how it was drafted, a date that couldn't be right, a notary block filled in for a day. I could prove I'd been 3 counties away at a doctor's appointment the foundation later used as evidence. "They got sloppy here, Dad," she said, tapping the page the exact way her mother used to tap that kitchen table. And the sight of it, my daughter tapping the page like Nora, near undid me. This isn't just a bad document. This is a crime you can hang a man on. They were in such a hurry they left the door unlocked. A paralegal's daughter, tapping the page like her mother, finding the unlocked door. Craig kept her 3 states away for 2 years because he could not afford to have her in the room. And he was right to be afraid of her. And he found out too late exactly how right. Kate took leave from her job and flew home, and I drove to the airport to get her myself, which Saul thought was foolish given everything I had going on. But there are some things a father does himself, or they don't count. I stood at the bottom of the escalator in the arrivals hall, the way I had when she was a girl, coming home from things, and I watched her ride down, my daughter, gray in her hair now that hadn't been there 2 years ago. Some of it I'd helped put there by believing a liar over her. She saw me, and for a second we both just stood there, 2 stubborn people who'd wasted 2 years, not knowing what our bodies were supposed to do. And then she dropped her bag right there on the floor, and came the last few steps fast, and put her arms around me. And I held my daughter in an airport for the first time in 2 years, and neither of us said a word, because there wasn't anything that needed saying that the holding didn't say better. An old man crying at an escalator? People must have thought someone had died. Someone had, in a way. Those 2 lost years died right there on that airport floor, and good riddance to them. Kate took leave from her job and flew home, and having her in it changed everything. Not the plan was sound, but me. I wasn't alone in it anymore, and there was one more person who wasn't going to be alone in it either, and that was Ivy. I have to tell you about a Saturday, a few weeks into all of it, because it's the heart of why I did everything the way I did. Ivy came out to the garage where I kept my bench, the way she still did when the house got to be too much for her. And she sat on the stool, 16 now, too old to be as quiet and careful and watchful as she'd become, a kid tiptoeing through her own home. And she picked up a practice lock off my bench and started working it, out of old habit, the way some kids doodle. And after a while, not looking at me, working the pins, she said, "Grandpa, can I ask you something and you tell me the truth? Are Mom and Dad being bad to you?" And I looked at that girl, my Ivy, and I had a choice to make. And I made it the way I hope I've made most of the ones that mattered. I didn't lie to her, but I didn't put a 16-year-old in the middle of a war with her own parents either. I said, "Ivy, there are some hard things happening that the grown-ups have to sort out, and some of them are going to be painful, and I'm not going to pretend to you that they're not, but I need you to hear the most important part, and I need you to look at me while I say it." And she looked up, and I said, "None of it is yours to carry. You hear me? Whatever your dad has done, you don't inherit it. Not the fault, not the shame, none of it. You are your own person, and what you are is a good, honest girl with the best hands I've ever taught and more patience than your grandmother, and that is worth more to me than every dollar and every deed in that safe. Whatever happens to this family, you and I are solid. You will always have a place with me and a place at that bench for exactly as long as you want one. And that watchful girl who'd been holding herself together in a house going wrong for longer than any kid should have to, set down the lock and came and put her arms around me, and I held my granddaughter in that garage and thanked Nora and God that at least one thing in the next generation had come up straight and true. While I was quietly building my case and mending my family, my son was doing what impatient, frightened men always do when they think they've won. He was getting careless. Overconfidence is the crack that brings the whole wall down, and Brad, breathing down his neck, had opened a wide one right through the middle of him. He took my after-dinner surrender. "I'll let you handle the money, son," as the green light he'd been starving for, and he moved. The pressure to sign came harder now, and more often. The clean package of papers appeared on the kitchen table one evening, the power of attorney and the quit claim, with Brad's smooth signature already witnessing where Brad had no business being, and Craig walked me through where to sign in that patient, condescending voice. And I made my hands tremble and asked slow, foggy questions, and finally set the pen down and said, my eyes were just swimming tonight. I'd get to it over the weekend with a clear head. I didn't want to make a mistake on something so important. And I watched my son work very hard to keep the frustration off his face, so close he could taste it, the foolish old man not quite signing again. They toured Maple Court a second time, and this time they were bold enough to take me along. Just to look, Dad, no pressure, it's a beautiful place. And I want to tell you about that tour, because I think some of you have taken it, or will take a parent on it, and there's a thing worth knowing. It was a beautiful place. That's the part nobody warns you about. Bright and clean and cheerful, with fresh flowers at the front desk, and a nice young woman who called me young man, and activities on a whiteboard, and the smell of good coffee laid carefully over the smell underneath, which was disinfectant. And under that, the smell of forgetting. And Craig and Denise walked me through it, beaming, pointing out the dining room and the garden and the companionship. And the nice young woman talked to Craig about me while I stood right there, the way they all do. And would he need help with medications? And Craig answered for me, and I smiled, and I said it seemed very nice. And I did what I've done my whole life in a strange building, which is find the exits and count them out of habit. And the whole time, walking those bright halls, I thought about the fact that they intended to pay for this file drawer with flowers, with my own money, and to move me into it once I'd signed them the last papers, and to feel good about it, to tell people it was the loving choice. He needed more support than we could give. There are people in Maple Court who need it and are loved and are exactly where they should be. I want to be fair, but there are others, and you can find them if you look, sitting by windows who had a house once and a name once and a family that got tired of waiting and who signed the papers themselves, thinking it was their idea. I looked at them on that tour. I made myself look, and I thought, not me, Nora, not while my name's on the papers. And I smiled at the nice young woman, and I thanked her for the tour. Denise raised the rent. There was a new invoice, a higher number, a note about increased costs, slid across the table with less ceremony than the first one, because they didn't think they had to be careful with me anymore. I paid it. Of course I paid it. Every dollar of that rent was another dated entry in Priya's ledger, another tumbler, another piece of the case they were building for me, without knowing it. And Craig stopped bothering to hide his contempt, now that he was sure I was beaten. That's the thing about a man like my son. The mask never fit him well, and the moment he thinks he doesn't need it, it comes all the way off. He talked about me in the third person while I sat in the room. He called the back bedroom the space we'll get back once Dad's settled. He introduced me at a barbecue to a man he was trying to impress as my father. He's not really up to much these days. We look after him, with a sad little laugh, and the man gave me that pat, pitying nod. And I smiled and shook his hand and thought about the deed to the ground we were all standing on, sitting in a safe 40 feet away with my name on it. My son had, in his own mind, already won. He was just waiting for the paperwork to catch up to a reality he'd already decided on. He never imagined the paperwork was a wall, and the wall was me, and I was about to let him run into it at full speed. Because while Craig accelerated, I did the slow, patient, unglamorous work that actually wins these things. The work men like my son never have the discipline for. With Saul, I quietly executed a new estate plan, a real one, read to me line by line the way an honest advisor does it, that did exactly what I wanted and locked out exactly whom I wanted locked out. All of it built on the rock of Nora's trust that Craig had never been able to touch. We made the deed to Craig's house ironclad and unambiguous, so there was no crack for Brad's notary to pry at. Nothing left to forge our way around. I put the $200,000 and my other savings beyond any reach but my own, formally, permanently. And I changed my will, this time for real, this time with my friend reading me every word, which is precisely the thing my son had spent 18 months making sure never happened. With Kate and Manny, I reached out carefully to the people who mattered, and with Sandy and Sewell, I did the most serious thing. We took the whole machine, the stolen money, the forged deed, Brad, the notary, the 3-move plan, the plan to use my money to warehouse me in Maple Court, and we brought it to the people whose job it is to care about exactly this. Adult Protective Services opened a file, and a detective from the Financial Crimes Unit, a careful, unhurried man named Cho, spent weeks walking every step of it, verifying every date and every document Priya and Sandy had assembled. And at the end of it, he had what he needed. He had the theft. He had the forgery ready to go, with a notary willing to swear to a signature I never made. He had the conspiracy. And he had, like everyone who came into this thing, a certain quiet interest in being in the room when it all got said out loud. Detective Cho told me something I've thought about since. He said, "Mr. Ferris, I work these cases all the time, and you know what almost none of them have? A victim who kept the paperwork, who kept his name on the deed, who walked the money out the back before they could grab it. Most of the folks I try to help, by the time it gets to me, it's already gone. The house is signed away, the accounts are drained, and it's my word and theirs against a family that says Grandpa's confused. You're the rarest thing I see. You're an old man they underestimated who was 3 moves ahead the whole time." And I said, "Detective, I'm not 3 moves ahead. My wife was, 15 years ago. I'm just finally doing what she told me." Everything was in place. The new estate plan, signed and sealed, the deed, ironclad, the money, safe, Kate, home, the evidence complete and verified, the law informed and waiting. All that was left was to choose the room and the moment, and I knew exactly the room. My son wanted my signatures at his kitchen table, in his house, the house he charged me rent for, the house I owned. So I decided that his kitchen table, in my house, was exactly where I'd give him my answer. So I set the bait, and I made it the one thing my son could not resist. I picked a Sunday, and a few days before it, I told Craig, in my smallest, most tired voice, that I'd made up my mind. I told him he'd been right all along, that I was ready to sign the power of attorney, ready to sign the paper that cleaned up the title, ready to move the house money into the joint account so the family could manage everything together and I could finally stop worrying. I told him I wanted to do it properly, all at once, and I wanted to do it as a family because the family was what Nora would have wanted. I asked him to have Brad there so all the paperwork could be handled by someone who knew the technical side, and to have the notary there so it could all be made official on the spot. I said I wanted it done right, with everyone present, so there'd never be any question later. And then I added the piece that made it irresistible. I said I'd ask Kate to fly in, so the whole family could be together for it, so nobody can ever say your old dad did something behind anyone's back. I could hear Craig's relief pour down the phone like water down a drain. Everything he wanted, gift-wrapped, delivered. The signatures, the money, the deed, the notary, all of it, and the old man asking to do it, eager to do it, at a nice family Sunday. He didn't even flinch at Kate coming. If anything, he liked it, because Kate in the room, witnessing the old man's sign of his own free will, would slam the last door on any trouble down the line. "Dad," he said, and his voice was thick with something he mistook for love, and was really just the taste of the finish line. That means a lot. That's the right thing. Mom would be proud of you. Mom would be proud of you." My son said that to me, as the grease to slide the taking of everything I had. "I'll have Brad bring everything. We'll make it a nice afternoon. This is going to be good for everybody." Yes, it was going to be that. He didn't know I'd be bringing guests to his nice afternoon. He didn't know that the kitchen table he'd set so carefully for the taking of my life had been quietly reserved by me for something else. The Sunday came, bright and cool, the kind of clear, hard light Nora loved, because she said it showed you the truth of a thing with nowhere left to hide. I dressed carefully, I put on a good shirt, and in the pocket of it, over my heart, I put a single folded piece of paper, and I sat at my son's kitchen table, my kitchen table, in my house, at the place they'd set for me, and I folded my hands, and I waited. Craig was in high spirits. I'd rarely seen him so easy, so warm. He kept touching my shoulder as he passed, calling me Dad, telling me what a good decision I was making. Denise had made coffee and set out a plate of the good cookies, playing hostess to the dismantling of her father-in-law. Brad arrived with a leather folio and a smile like a closing door, and he shook my hand and told me I was doing the smart thing, the responsible thing, and I said I surely hoped so. The notary came, a tired-looking man who wouldn't quite meet anyone's eye, and set up his little stamp and his book at the end of the table. Craig laid the documents out at my place, squared them up, neat, set a good pen beside them, and pulled out the chair for me like I was a guest of honor, which I suppose, in a way, I was. And then the doorbell rang, and it was Kate, and Craig went to let his sister in, all smiles, playing the good brother. And I watched him not have the first idea that he'd just opened his own front door to the beginning of the end. "Before we start," I said, once everyone had settled and the coffee was poured, and Brad had his folio open, and the notary had his stamp ready, "I've asked a couple more people to join us. I hope nobody minds. They should be right outside." Craig's smile flickered. "Dad, this is just family. We don't need—" "It's my signing, Craig," I said, mildly, pleasantly. The first sentence I'd said in that house in 2 years, with any iron in it, and it landed like iron, and I watched him hear it. "I'd like them to come in." And the door opened. They came in one at a time, and I watched my son's nice afternoon come apart with every face that crossed the threshold. First came Sol Weinstein, my lawyer and my friend of 40 years, carrying a thick portfolio, and Craig's smile went stiff because he knew Sol. Sol had drawn up the old papers, and a lawyer he didn't control was not part of any plan of his. Then came Priya Desai with her binder, and old Manny Rosales, who'd loved Nora, and who fixed Craig with a look that could have stripped paint. Then Sandy Kirk with those flat, patient eyes, and behind her, and here Craig actually rose halfway out of his chair, Detective Cho, in a plain jacket, with a badge clipped to his belt for everyone to see. And last, my Kate, who'd flown in not to witness me, sign my life away but to help me take it back, standing beside her mother's old friends with her mother's straight spine, looking at her brother with her mother's eyes. "What is this?" Craig said. It wasn't a question. All the warmth was gone, and the kitchen had gone dead quiet, that held breath quiet. Only this time, it wasn't falling over me. This time, it was falling over him. "Sit down, son," I said, quietly. I have never once in my life needed to raise my voice to be heard, and I didn't raise it now. "We're going to have the meeting, just not the one you planned. Sit down and let me open a few things up for everybody. It's what I do." And there was a moment, I'll remember it always, where I watched my son look at the door, at the documents, at Brad, at the notary, at the detective, calculating, always calculating, hunting for the angle, the smile, the reasonable thing that had gotten him out of everything his whole life. And he found nothing, and he sat down. "Sol," I said, "would you begin? Start with the house. Whose is it?" And Sol Weinstein opened his portfolio, and in a flat, clear voice with not 1 ounce of pity in it, began to read. He read the deed. He read the trust. He read, in plain words that filled that kitchen and could not be unheard, the fact that my son had spent months trying to hide, and years never thinking to check, that the house we were all sitting in, the house Craig had lived in for 15 years and called his own, the house he'd charged his own father rent to sleep in, the house Brad had come to help refinance and strip, did not belong to Craig, had never belonged to Craig, belonged free and clear, deed and title, to Raymond Ferris, held in the trust of Nora Ferris, and could not be sold, refinanced, borrowed against, or quit claimed by anyone but me. I watched it land on my son. I watched him understand, at last, what the cloud on the title was. I watched him understand that the wall he'd been throwing himself against for months, growing crueler and more frantic with every month, had a name, and the name was his father, sitting quietly at the head of the table the whole time. And I watched him understand that the rent, The rent he'd charged me, the rent invoices he'd slid across this very table. The rent he'd told his wife was to soften me up and make me feel like a cost. He'd been charging the owner of the house rent to live in it. Brad went a shade of gray. The notary quietly closed his book. I want to tell you what my son's face did in that moment, because I'd waited a long time to see it, and it wasn't what I expected. I thought I'd feel triumph. I didn't. What I saw on Craig's face when he finally understood was a child's face. For just a second, before the man clamped down over it, I saw the boy who'd cut his first key crooked. The boy on the stool. And that boy was looking at his father with the oldest, simplest terror there is. The terror of a kid who's done something and knows finally that it can't be undone. And then it was gone. And the grown man's calculation slammed back down over it. But I saw it, and it didn't make me glad. It made me tired, and it made me grieve, because I understood in that second that I was watching the exact moment my son's whole life caught up with him. And no father, not even a wronged one, is glad to see that on his child's face. Nora would have wept. I nearly did. But I had 4 more things to open on that table, and a locksmith finishes the job. Now the money, I said. Priya. And Priya Desai stood and, in her cool, unhurried way, read the theft. She read the small withdrawals from the old account, the ones that started. She said the date out loud, and I watched Kate's hand go to her mouth. The week her grandmother was diagnosed. She read the rent and the household expenses that never added up, and the truck that was sold with the money never reaching me, and the transfers, dollar by dollar, dated, sourced, undeniable. And then Sandy Kirk stood and laid out the plan. The power of attorney, the quit claim, Maple Court, Brad, the whole 3-move machine. And last, she laid the forged quit claim on the table, the one with a witness line, and a place for a notary to swear that Ray Ferris had signed a thing Ray Ferris never touched. And she looked down the table at Brad, and then at the tired notary, and she said, "You want to talk about this one before or after the detective does?" Craig tried once to do the thing that had always saved him. I watched him gather himself, watched the smooth come back over his face like water closing over a dropped stone, and he spread his hands and he said, reasonable, warm, the steakhouse voice, "Okay, everybody, let's all just slow down. This is a family matter that's gotten blown way out of proportion by people who don't understand our situation. My father has been struggling since we lost my mother. He gets confused. He's been fed a very one-sided story, and frankly, some of the people in this room have their own agendas. The arrangements we made were to help him. Everything I did to protect him. If we could all just take a breath." And he might have gotten somewhere, in another room, with a different audience, because he was good. He was genuinely good at it. It was the one true skill he ever mastered. But Sol Weinstein didn't even look up from his portfolio. He just said, in the dry, flat voice of a man who's heard every clever thing a cornered man ever said, "Craig, the house you're sitting in isn't yours. It's your father's. And it's been your father's for 15 years. And you tried to refinance it 4 times and were told 4 times there was a defect in the title, and instead of asking why, you had Mr. Coyle prepare a forged quitclaim deed to steal it out of a trust you don't control. Would you like to explain to the notary at the end of the table why you needed his stamp on a signature your father was never going to give?" And the smooth just stopped. It ran out of road. There was nowhere for it to go. I watched my son open his mouth and find nothing in it, maybe for the first time in his whole charmed and charming life, and I understood that the thing that had saved him from every consequence since he was 6 years old had finally, at 47, met a room it could not talk its way out of. And in the silence that followed, that was when Brad Coyle decided to save himself. Brad Coyle did exactly what men like Brad always do, the instant the badge is real and the paper is on the table. He threw everyone he had into the fire to buy himself an inch. This was their operation, he said fast, hands up, already half turned toward Detective Cho. Craig came to me, he owed me, he needed the equity out of the house, he told me the old man was senile and wouldn't know the difference. The notary thing was his idea. I was just consulting. I want that on the record. I have texts. "Shut your mouth, Brad," Craig said. And there it was at last, the real voice, the real face, the thing that had always been under the smile, out in the hard Sunday light, with nowhere left to hide. And Denise, who had built this with him, who had typed the rent invoice and toured Maple Court and told him to put a paper in front of the old man and watch him sign his name off the planet. Denise turned on her husband too, because there is no loyalty among people who were only ever in it for themselves. "You told me it was legal," she said, her voice climbing. "You told me Brad had it handled, that it was all above board, that the house was ours." And Craig said, "Denise, don't." And she said, "Don't you tell me don't." And the whole rotten alliance came apart across that kitchen table in about 15 seconds, each of them reaching for whoever they could stand on to keep their own head above the water. And I sat and watched it, quiet, the way you watch a cheap lock finally give and spill its pins. And then I did the last thing, the thing that was mine to do, because it was the deepest cut and a father should deliver that one himself. I reached into my shirt pocket, over my heart, and I took out the single folded piece of paper, and I unfolded it, and I laid it flat on the table. It was a transcript. Sandy had gotten the recording. There had been a recording in the end, of more than one of those midnight kitchen conversations, because a house wired for security by a locksmith has ears the locksmith knows about and his son forgot. And this was the worst of them, typed out, in Craig's own words. And I didn't read all of it. I just read the part I'd carried in my pocket for weeks. I read, in my quiet, steady voice, to the whole room. The rent's about him getting used to the idea that he's a cost. It softens him up for Maple Court. You move him there once he already thinks of himself as a burden. Then he goes quietly. Then he's grateful even. And then I read the last line. And I read it looking at my son, not at the paper, because I had it by heart. Poor old bastard. He really would sign anything. You know the worst part? He thinks he's finally part of the family in here. He thinks this is us taking care of him. I set the paper down, and the kitchen was so quiet you could hear the clock over the stove, the clock I'd hung there myself 15 years ago, in the house that was mine. Craig sat in the wreckage of his nice afternoon and did the only thing he had left. He turned to me, and the tears came up fast and easy, the way they always could when he needed them, and he said, Dad, please. I was drowning. You don't understand the pressure I was under. Brad was going to. I made mistakes, but I never wanted to hurt you. You have to believe me. I'm your son. Whatever happens here, I'm still your son. Dad, please." And he reached his hand across the table toward me, the same hand I'd tried to teach the trade to when he was a boy, the hand that had good bones in it once, and the whole room held its breath to see what the old man would do. I did not take his hand. But I did not shout either. And I want you to understand that that was the most important thing I did in that kitchen, maybe in this whole story. My son wanted a scene. He wanted an old man's rage, something loud and ugly he could point to afterward, so he could tell himself and everyone else that this was just a family coming apart, a hard old father and a desperate son, two stubborn men who never got along, and not what it actually was, which was a careful theft, finally dragged into the daylight. I would not give him that. I gave him the truth instead, in the plainest voice I own. "You charged me rent," I said, "to sleep in a house I own. And when you did it, you told your wife it was to teach me I was a burden, so I'd go quiet into a home you were going to pay for with my own money. I've been asking myself for months why a man would do that to his father. And I know now. You did it because you were sure you'd already won. You were sure the old man was foggy and small and finished, and you didn't have to pretend anymore. But you never had it, Craig. Not for one single day. Your mother saw to that 15 years ago at a kitchen table because she looked at the world clear and she loved you anyway, and she protected the rest of us from the loving. Everything you tried to take from people who trusted you, from a wife you dragged into it, from a sister you lied out of the room, from a father who was burying your mother the week you started counting his money. That's the harvest, son. A man reaps what he sows, and you sowed nothing your whole life but wanting. I didn't do this to you. You did this. I'm just the locksmith who finally stopped pretending the door was stuck and admitted it was locked and remembered I had the key. He had nothing to answer with. For the first time in his charmed and charming life, my son opened his mouth and found nothing in it. Detective Cho stepped forward then, quiet and almost gentle about it, which somehow made it heavier, not lighter. There were things that happened over the following hour that I won't dress up. Brad and the notary answering for the forgery, Craig answering for the theft and the fraud and the conspiracy. the careful machinery of the law beginning to turn on the men who'd built the machine to grind me. Adult Protective Services had a role too. There were reports made, a file opened, the slow official acknowledgement that what had been done to me had a name in the statutes and the name was a crime. I'll tell you one small thing from that hour because it stayed with me. At one point, Detective Cho, going through the formalities with Craig, asked him, plainly for the record, to confirm his home address. And there was a silence, because the answer was the address of the house we were standing in, my house. And my son sat there and could not make himself say it, could not say, "This is my home," because everyone in that kitchen had just heard Soul read the deed, and for the first time in 15 years, Craig understood that he did not have a home address to give, that the roof over his head had never been his, that he was, in the eyes of the law and the county and the truth, a man being removed from his father's house. He gave the address in a voice I'd never heard him use, and I understood, watching it, that the whole thing had come full circle in that one small question. He'd charged me rent to establish, on paper, that I was a boarder in his house. And now, on the record, in front of a detective, he could not claim the house at all. The tenant was the owner. The owner had never been anything but a guest who forgot to check the papers. Every lock turns both ways, if you wait long enough. The house went quiet after they had gone. Craig processed and released on conditions to await what was coming. Brad taken. The notary shrunk to nothing. Denise upstairs with Ivy. My house went quiet. And it was a strange quiet, not the boarder's quiet I'd lived in for a year, and not yet the good owner's quiet I sleep in now. It was the quiet right after a lock finally gives. That half second of stillness when the last pin has fallen and the thing that swore would never open is standing open, and you sit there on the floor in front of it, not triumphant, just tired and quiet and changed. But before any of that quiet, in the middle of the hour, I got up from the table and I went and found Ivy, because Ivy was in the house. Of course she was. It was a Sunday. She'd been up in her room, and she'd come halfway down the stairs when the voices started, and she was sitting on the landing, 16 years old, watching her family come apart at the seams below her, her face white, her arms wrapped around her knees. And I climbed those stairs, these old knees and all, and I sat down next to my granddaughter on the landing, and I put my arm around her, and I said, "I've got you. Whatever happens down there, you hear me? I've got you, and none of it is yours, and you and I are solid as that safe in the garage." And she turned her face into my shoulder and cried, and I held her, and down below the law did its work, and I stayed on the stairs with the one thing in that house I'd been protecting all along, and I let the rest of it happen without me. Some things matter more than being in the room when the trap springs. A frightened 16-year-old on a staircase mattered more than watching my son answer for himself. I've never once regretted choosing the stairs. She asked me something on those stairs that I'll carry the rest of my life. She said small into my shoulder, "Is it my fault for loving you? Is that why, Dad?" And I stopped her right there. I took her by the shoulders and I made her look at me and I said, "Ivy, listen to me. Loving me is the best thing you ever did, and it is not the cause of a single bad thing that's happening in this house. Your father did what he did because of what's missing in him, not because of what's good in you. You hearing me? The good in you didn't cause any of this. The good in you is the only thing that's going to grow up out of it." And I held her while the professionals below dismantled her family. And I thought about how the cruelest thing these people do isn't even to us, the old ones. We've had our lives. The cruelest thing is what they do to the Ivies, the good young ones who have to watch, who have to learn too early that the people who are supposed to love you can be the ones who rob you, who carry a wound about it that they didn't earn, protecting her from carrying that wound, undeserved, for the rest of her life. That was the whole ballgame in the end. Not the deed, not the money, her. I did not walk away from the wreckage and lick my wounds. I've never once in my life walked off a job because it got hard, and I wasn't going to start at 75. A locksmith who opens a jammed lock doesn't leave the door hanging. He sees what's broken and he fixes it better than it was. And there was a great deal to fix because bringing my son down was never the point. It was only the moment the bleeding stopped. The healing came after, and the healing was the real work. The strangest thing to reckon with in those first weeks was the house, because I owned it. The house my son had charged me rent for, the house I'd been made a boarder in, the house I'd been apologizing for existing in for a year. It was mine, deed and title, free and clear, and had been all along. And now, Craig was facing charges, and Denise was facing the ruin of the life she'd built on a lie. And there was a real and legal question that landed in my lap, quiet and heavy. What does a man do when he suddenly holds eviction power over his own son's family in a house full of his own grandchild's whole childhood? I'll tell you what I did, and I'll tell you it wasn't simple, and it wasn't all mercy, and it wasn't all iron. I let them stay at first for Ivy's sake, because whatever her parents were, Ivy was 16 and hadn't done a thing, and you don't rip a child's roof off to punish the people who wronged you. But it couldn't hold, and it didn't. With Craig charged and everything out in the light, Denise took Ivy and moved to her sister's in the next county, which was, I think, the first genuinely sensible thing Denise did in this whole story, getting her daughter out of the middle of it. And the house, my house, I did not sell, and I did not move back into. Not right away, because it held too much of the year I'd been small in it. I kept it. I keep it still. And I'll tell you at the end what became of it, because it turned into something I never expected, something Nora would have laughed her rushing little laugh to see. The money came home, most of it. The way it does when an honest accountant and a patient investigator and a detective who kept the paperwork all pull in the same direction. The big prize, the $200,000 from the sale of my house, had never left my hands thanks to Nora, and never would. The money they had managed to bleed, the withdrawals and the rent and the truck and the padded expenses, Priya traced and the court clawed back, dollar by dollar, and every dollar of it I put where it belonged, which I'll come to. I even got a truck again. Not the old one, that was long gone, but a good one, bought with my own recovered money, in my own name, parked in my own driveway. And I'll tell you, there is no feeling quite like a man of 75 getting the keys to his own truck, back after a year of having no keys to anything. I sat in it in the driveway the first evening, and I just held the keys a while. A locksmith knows what keys mean. Keys mean you're the one who decides who comes and goes. I'd been a year without a single key to my own life. Getting them back, one at a time, was most of the healing. Brad Coyle, it turned out, had done this to other families, and once one thread came loose, the whole garment did. There were other old people, other stripped houses, other forged papers, and Brad answered for a good many of them, not just mine, which is the one thing in this story that lets me sleep easiest of all, that stopping the man who'd have kept doing it to others was, in the end, part of what my patience bought. The notary lost his commission and his liberty for a while, for swearing to signatures that men like Brad paid him not to look at too closely. And Craig, my son, who had good hands once and threw them away, reaching for money he hadn't made, Craig faced the law. The law took its time with my son, the way it does. Slow, maddeningly slow, so slow that more than once I wondered whether I'd live to see the end of it. But the wheels grind all the way down, even when they grind slow, and when they finish they don't turn back. The case against Craig and Brad was as clean as anything Detective Cho said he'd handled, because that's what happens when the victim kept his name on the deed, kept the money out of reach, kept the records, wired the house that recorded the confession, and had a paralegal daughter and a 40-year lawyer and a forensic accountant all standing in his corner. There wasn't much fight left in it once it was all on the table. Craig's lawyer looked at the mountain, the traced money, the forged quitclaim, the bought notary, Brad turning state's witness, and my son's own voice describing his own plan, and did the only sane thing, which was to negotiate. Craig pleaded financial elder abuse, fraud, conspiracy, theft. Brad pleaded to a longer list, given the other families. There were sentences and restitution and conditions, and I'll not walk you through all of it, because the procedure isn't the point, and never was. I went to the sentencing. I sat in the back on a hard bench, in a good shirt, and I watched the last chapter of my son's long-reaching end in a few flat sentences from a judge who'd plainly seen 1,000 men like Craig and run out of patience for every one of them. My son didn't rage the way he'd raged for that 1 second in the kitchen when the mask came off. He stood there smaller than I'd ever seen him, in a suit that didn't seem to fit the man inside it anymore. His shoulders rounded, and for the first time since he was a boy, he had no smile that would work and nothing to say. He didn't turn around to look at me. I honestly don't know what I'd have done if he had. And on that hard bench, I grieved him one more time. Not the man being sentenced, but the boy on the stool at my bench, the boy with the good hands, the boy who cut his first key crooked and grinned at me like he'd hung the moon. That boy had been gone a long, long time, somewhere I hadn't been watching. I'd just never let myself hold the funeral until that day, with a judge for a preacher. Denise didn't go to jail. Denise had been a builder of this thing, but not, in the eyes of the law, the architect of the crimes that carried cells. And there's no statute for cowardice and cruelty and typing your father-in-law a rent invoice, though there ought to be a mirror somewhere she has to look into. Her marriage did not survive it. I don't know a marriage that survives one spouse taking the fall and the other having testified to save herself, and I won't pretend to mourn it. She and Ivy live in the next county. She has never once apologized to me, and I've stopped waiting for it, and I've made a kind of peace with the fact that some people simply cannot say the words, because saying them would mean facing what they are. She's not my concern. She never really was. My concern, the whole way through, was the girl she took with her. Because there was one member of my son's family I was never, ever finished with, and it was the one that mattered. There was Ivy. I kept Ivy close through all of it, careful never to put her in the middle, never asking her to choose against her mother, just being the one steady thing she could count on. And when the dust settled and she asked me, shyly, the way she asked me everything that mattered, whether she could still come to the bench on Saturdays, whether that was still allowed now that everything was so broken, I told her the truth, which was that it wasn't just allowed, it was the thing I most looked forward to in the whole of my week. So, she comes more than ever, and that brings me to what I did with the will, and with the house, and with everything my son tried so hard to take, because a man's will is the last word he gets in this world, and I'd decided, on a dark night listening through a heating vent, that I intended to be heard. I did not split everything evenly, the way a gentler and more foolish version of me once planned. That plan died at a kitchen table. Craig. I cut out entirely, not out of vengeance, but out of plain justice, because you do not hand a man a fortune as a reward for trying to steal it, and because leaving Craig so much as $1 of what I built would have been a betrayal of every truth this story is made of. I thought hard about it, over weeks, because there's a voice in a father that says he's still your son. Leave him something. Blood is blood. I know that voice. But there's an older thing a father owes than that voice, and it's this. He owes the truth about who his children actually are, and he owes protection to the ones his children might yet harm. To arm Craig with money again would only point him at some new victim, someday. So, I cut him out, cleanly, clear-eyed, and I have not lost a night's sleep over it. Kate I provided for fully and freely, my daughter who was lied out of the room, who came home the moment I asked and stood in my corner with her mother's spine. Kate gets what a beloved and trusted child should get, without conditions, without a trust to manage her, because Kate never once in her life needed managing. And Ivy. I did not make the heir to a fortune, because a fortune handed to a child is the exact poison that rotted her father, and I love that girl far too much to feed it to her. What I'm leaving Ivy is better and harder, and it's the only inheritance I've ever known to be worth having. I'm leaving her the trade, the shop, the bench, and the tools, and the name, Ferris lock, and security, and, if she wants it and earns it, the whole of the honest work Nora and I built, to be hers, not because she was born to it, but because she loves it, and she's good at it, and she came up through it the right way, Saturday by Saturday, key by key. She's apprenticing now formally, 16 years old, and the best young hand I've ever trained, more patient than her grandmother, with the surest fingers I've felt on a lock in 50 years. She's going to be a master someday, a real one, better than me. And when she is, the name Ferris is going to mean, for another 50 years, exactly what it meant for the first 50. A person you can trust, with the keys to everything you have. I told her once what it was I was really leaving her. It was a Saturday at the bench, and she just opened a lock that had given me trouble at her age, opened it clean, feeling for the pins with that stillness she has, and she looked up grinning, and I decided she was old enough to hear it plain. I said, Ivy, you know I'm not leaving you money. You know that, right? Your dad wanted money, and money's what ruined him. I'm leaving you this. And I put my hand on the bench, the old scarred bench, Nora's and mine, the shop, the trade, the name, and the one thing that's worth more than all of it, and that most people never get handed at all, a way to be trusted. You learn this trade the right way, and you'll hold the keys to half the town someday, same as I did, and every single one of those people will sleep better because a Ferris has the key. That's not a small thing, honey. That's the biggest thing there is. Your dad thought this work was a man on his knees. It's the opposite. It's a person the whole town stands on. And she looked at me, 16, serious, taking it in the way she takes everything in, and she said, "I know, Grandpa. I've always known. That's why I kept coming down here even when Dad said not to. And I had to turn away and busy myself with the drawer for a minute, because I hadn't known that Craig had told her not to come, and she'd come anyway, all those years, choosing the bench over her own father's wishes because some true thing in her knew where the real inheritance was. She's going to be a master someday, a real one, better than me. That's the inheritance. Not money, the trade, and the name, and the trust. My son wanted the appearance of things. My granddaughter wants the real thing. I know which one to leave the shop to. Then I did the thing I cared about most of all. I took a great deal of what I had, not all of it, but a great deal, more than my son ever dreamed existed for him to steal. And I built a foundation in Nora's name, the Nora Ferris Foundation, and its purpose is the simplest, truest thing I know how to say. It exists for old people who are being talked out of their homes and their money and their independence by the very families who are supposed to protect them. The ones being told, gently, reasonably, with a smile, to sell the empty house and move in, to sign the papers they don't need to read, to hand over the wheel to people who've already priced their loneliness. I know now, the way you only know a thing after it's happened to you, how many of us there are, in back bedrooms, on rent schedules, on tours of nice bright facilities that smell of forgetting, being made small a filing at a time, and most of them will never get what I got. Most of them don't have a Nora who built a fortress 15 years early, or a safe only they can open, or the means to hire a Soul and a Sandy and a Priya. Most of them just fade, quietly, on schedule, exactly the way they're meant to. So, the foundation pays for exactly that. The lawyers, the investigators, the forensic accountants, the ones who can prove what's being done to a person nobody will believe because they're old and it's their own family doing it. It stands in the corner of one frightened, written-off old soul after another, strangers Nora never met, and it will go on standing there long after I'm in the ground beside her. The first person the foundation ever helped, I'll carry with me the rest of my days. He was a retired mechanic, 79, 2 towns over, and his daughter and her husband had done to him almost exactly what mine tried to do to me. Talked him out of his paid-off house, moved him into a back room, put him on an allowance of his own money, and started the paperwork to take the rest and tuck him into a facility. But he had no Nora, and no safe, and no way to hire the people who could prove it, and when he tried to tell his doctor and his bank, they'd given him that same soft, pitying look I knew so well. The look that says, "Poor old fellow, he's getting confused," and turn back to the reasonable, concerned daughter. He was completely alone, and he knew it, and there was not one thing he could do. Until the foundation put a lawyer and an investigator in his corner at no cost to him, and in a few months we had it laid out flat, and his home was saved, and he got to grow old in it, on his own terms. I went to see him once. He gripped my hand in both of his and said, "Everyone told me I was imagining it. You're the first person who believed me." And I told him the truth, that a woman named Nora believed him, and had believed people like him long before either of us was born, and would go on believing them long after we were both gone. That's what the foundation is. It's Nora, still believing the ones nobody believes. There have been many since that first old mechanic, more than I'd have guessed, which tells you something about the size of this quiet thing that happens to people in back bedrooms all over the country. There was a woman, 84, whose grandson had moved into her house to help, and then changed the locks on her while she was at the doctor and left her things on the porch. There was a retired teacher whose daughter had him sign a power of attorney just for emergencies, and then emptied 40 years of careful saving in a summer. There was a man who'd stopped speaking almost entirely, who everyone had agreed was declining, and who turned out to be perfectly sharp and simply terrified into silence, because every time he'd tried to say what was being done to him, the family had used it as more proof he was confused. That one I think about at night, because that was almost me. That's the trap, the real one, underneath all the paperwork. They tell everyone you're confused, and then anything you say to defend yourself becomes proof of the confusion. And the more upset you get, the more confused you look, until you learn it's safer to go quiet and then they point at the quiet and say, "See, he's not himself anymore." The foundation exists to be the one voice in the room that says, "What if he's not confused? What if he's telling the truth and no one will check?" We check. We're the ones who check, and you would not believe, or maybe if you've lived it, you would, how often the confused old fool turns out to have been right the whole time, and just needed one single person with the means to believe him and the patience to look. And then I went back to work. Not the way I used to. My hands aren't what they were, and some cold mornings the fingers ache so I can hardly close them around a pick. But I go in, a few days a week I go into the shop, and I teach. Young people, the foundation sends me some of them, kids with nothing in their pockets but willing hands and a little patience. I teach them the trade, how to read a lock by feel, how to cut a key true, how to crack a safe that's forgotten its own combination, and most of all, how to hold a trust and never once misuse it, because that, not the picks, is the actual profession. My hands still know the work, and they still know how to hand it down. Some things get into a man's hands so deep that age can't quite dig them back out. There was a young fellow last winter, 19, no father around, a chip on his shoulder the size of a deadbolt, sent to me half by chance through one of the foundation's programs. First week, he was all attitude, sure the old man had nothing to teach him, sure locks were beneath a young man with places to be. And I knew that armor because it's the armor a kid wears when nobody's ever once told him he was worth teaching. So I didn't fight it, I just put a lock in his hands and taught him to feel the first pin, and then the next, and I told him the truth every time he got one right, which was more often than he expected. And I watched the armor come off him a pin at a time, the way it does when a person finally meets someone who takes them seriously. By spring, he could open things that would have stumped me at his age, and he was prouder of it than he'd ever been of the attitude. At the end of his time with me, he stuck out his hand, awkward, not knowing how to say it, and said, "Thanks for not writing me off the first week, Mr. Ferris. Everybody always does." And I shook his hand and thought, that right there, that's the whole trade. It was never really about the locks. It was about being the man who doesn't write you off. The man who will sit on the floor of a cold, dark bakery for 2 hours because what's inside matters to you. The man who'll feel for the good in a 19-year-old the same patient way he'd feel for a tumbler. My son wanted to sell all of that because he couldn't see it, so he was sure it wasn't there. But it was always the realest thing we had. I'll tell you what became of the house, my son's house, the one I owned, the one I paid rent in. It sat empty for a while after Denise took Ivy to the next county, and I couldn't decide what to do with it, and then one day it came to me, and Nora would have laughed her rushing little laugh to hear it. I moved into it. I moved into the very house I'd been a boarder in, and I took that back bedroom and garage where I'd sat by my safe in the dark being made small, and I turned the garage into the finest home workshop I've ever had. A real bench, good light, the old safe still bolted to the slab in the corner where it always won. And that garage, the room they charge me rent for, is where Ivy comes on Saturdays now to learn the trade she'll carry after I'm gone. The room where I was made a stranger in my own family is the room where I'm handing my family's best hand the keys to everything that matters. I sleep in that house now, my house, and it's quiet, but it's a different quiet than the boarder's quiet was. It's the quiet of a man in his own home with his name on the deed, which is the best sleeping quiet there is. People ask me if it's strange, living there, in the house where I was made small, sleeping down the hall from the kitchen, where I heard my son call me a poor old bastard through the vent. And I'll tell you the truth. For a while it was. For a while every room had a ghost of the boarder in it, the small apologetic man I'd been for that year. And I'd catch myself, out of habit, being quiet in my own kitchen, keeping out of the front room, and I'd have to stop and say out loud to the empty house, "This is mine, I can stand wherever I want." But a strange thing happened, slow, the way the good things happen. The house changed under me, or I changed in it. The garage where I sat by my safe in the dark, being made small, became the best workshop I've ever had, full of light and Ivy's laughter on Saturdays. The kitchen where I heard the worst thing I've ever heard became the kitchen where Kate cooks badly and laughs about it, and my granddaughter does her homework at the table. The front room I wasn't allowed in became the room where I read in the evenings in the best chair, the one I bought myself, with nobody to tell me I made the company uncomfortable. Room by room, I took the house back. Not just legally, I'd always had that. I took it back in the way that actually matters, by filling it with a life that was mine and honest and unafraid. That's the thing about a house they steal from you from the inside. Getting the deed back is the easy part, if you kept your name on the papers. Getting the home back is the work of a year of Saturdays. But it can be done. I'm proof it can be done. The room where they made me a stranger is the room where I'm happiest now. And if that isn't the whole story of my life in one sentence, I don't know what is. I won't pretend I got everything back. I didn't. The house Nora and I raised our children in, the one I wired and locked and loved for 40 years, the one that still smelled like her in the closets, that one is gone. I sold it to strangers in my grief because my son used his mother's memory as the lever to pry me out of it. And there's no clawing that back, no court that can undo it. And I've had to make my peace with the loss of it. And here's the peace I made, and I offer it to you if you need it. Home was never the house. Home was Nora. The house was just the box we kept our life in. And I lost the box, and it hurt, and it still does. But they never got the life. They never got Nora. You cannot sell a woman's memory, and you cannot foreclose on 46 years. And the man who carries those things carries his home with him into any room he stands in, back bedroom or bench or hard courtroom bench. And he is never, in the way that counts, without a home at all. My daughter Kate is home more now, not living here. She has her own life, 3 states away, and I would never take it from her again, having only just gotten her back. But she comes often, more than often, and she's on the board of the foundation, Nora's foundation, and she pours into it the same careful, clear-eyed fury her mother had, reading every document like there's a snake in the fine print, because she's seen that there usually is. It heals something in her, I think, to spend her days standing in the corner of old people who have no one, the way she once might have stood in mine if she hadn't been lied out of the room. She and Ivy have grown close, aunt and niece, the 2 clean lengths of grain in this family, and it does an old man's heart more good than I can say to watch them together at my kitchen table in my house, laughing over something. The family my son tried to strip for parts putting up green shoots out of the ash. There's an empty chair, of course. There's always an empty chair now, Craig's chair, and I won't pretend to you it doesn't ache to see it, because it does, and it always will. A father doesn't stop loving a son because the son turned out to be a thief. That isn't how a father's heart is wired. I ache for him. I write to him. I'll keep writing to him. And if the day ever comes that there's a real man on the other end of those letters, not the smooth one, not the boy who only ever wanted, but someone who's actually reckoned with what he did, then I'll be there, because that door I will never lock, not while I breathe. But I've learned the hard thing, the thing it took me 75 years and a rent invoice to finally understand. You can love a person with your whole heart and still not hand them the key. Love and trust are not the same lock. Nora tried to teach me that for 46 years. I learned it the hard way at a kitchen table, with a stranger's stamp waiting to make a forgery legal. Forgiveness you give freely because it heals the one who gives it. But trust is earned every time by everyone, and a man who forgets the difference will spend his life being robbed by the people he loves and calling it family. People ask me, the few who know the whole story, how a son turns out like that. How a boy who cut his first key crooked at your bench and grinned at you grows into a man who charges his own father rent and plans to forge him out of his house. I've turned it over more than anything else, in the good quiet of my own home, and I'll give you the closest thing to an answer I've found, though I warn you it's not comfortable, and some of it points back at me. I think we gave Craig too much and asked too little, because he was first, and because we had so little when he came, and so much by the time he was grown, we let him believe that the having was the point. He never rode the bicycle. He never worked the ice storm for $40 and a fever. He never sat at the kitchen table certain it was all over. He arrived after the hard part was done, and he mistook the harvest for the whole of farming, and we let him, because we loved him and wanted his road smoother than ours. And an easy road, it turns out, is a kind of poison if it's the only road a person ever walks. Kate had it harder, chose harder, made her own way. And Kate came up true. Ivy is choosing hard right now, choosing the bench and the patience and the trade, and Ivy is coming up true. Craig had it easy, and easy hollowed him out, until there was nothing left inside but the wanting. I don't say that to excuse him. A man of 47 owns his own soul, and plenty of people are handed ease and don't become thieves. But I helped build the man who charged me rent, and honesty makes me say so. That's a thing a father has to carry. I carry it. I'll carry it to Nora's side of the ground. So, let me tell you what I've come to understand now, on the far side of all of it. An old locksmith in his own house at last, who very nearly ended his days a stranger in his own family. And I'm telling you this part, especially for the ones out there listening from a back bedroom tonight. The ones on a rent schedule in a house you helped buy. The ones being told, gently, reasonably, with a smile, that the smart thing, the loving thing, is to sell up and sign over and move along. I know that chair. I sat in it for a year. So hear me, from a man who got out of it. They told me the smart thing, the loving thing, the thing Nora would have wanted, was to sell my house and move in and hand everything over. And for a while I believed them, because I was lonely and frightened and grieving, and that is exactly the lock they pick. They never come at you with cruelty. Cruelty you'd see coming. They come with concern, and with a smile, and with your own dead wife's memory turned into a lever. And they talk you gently out of the front door of your own life while telling you it's for your own good. That's the con. It runs on love, or the counterfeit of it. And the cruelest part isn't the taking. It's that first they make you believe you deserve to be taken from, make you feel like a burden, a cost, a border, so that when they finally slide the last paper across the table, you'll sign it yourself and thank them and think it was your idea. I've thought a great deal about that rent invoice, the neat little bill my son typed up to charge his father for a room in his father's own house. Because on its face, it's almost too small to matter. A few $100s, nothing next to a house and a fortune. But I understand now that the invoice was never about the money, and that's exactly what made it the coldest thing in the whole story until the vent. The rent was a tool. It was my son and his wife establishing a fact in writing, on paper, for the record, that I was a tenant, a line item, a cost, that my place in my own family was now something I rented by the month and could be evicted from. Craig said it himself through that heating vent. The rent's about him getting used to the idea that he's a cost. It softens him up. That's what a rent invoice to your own father is. It's not a bill, it's a demolition. It's the careful, itemized dismantling of a man standing in his own family, one line at a time, until he's small enough and grateful enough and sure enough that he's a burden that he'll go quietly wherever you point him. If you take one thing from an old locksmith tonight, take this. When the people who are supposed to love you start, ever so reasonably, to turn your place among them into a transaction, when they start keeping accounts and charging you for your keep and reminding you what you cost, that is not thrift and it is not fairness, whatever they call it. That is the first tumbler. Feel for it and go check whose name is on the deed. But here's what my son forgot, sitting at the head of a table charging his father rent. He forgot whose house it was. Not in the way he thought he knew. He thought he knew. He'd lived there 15 years. He'd have sworn on his life the house was his. He forgot in the way that turned out to be the only way that mattered. He forgot to check the deed. He forgot that generosity isn't the same as surrender, that a father can pay for every board of your house and still keep his name on the papers, that the man in the back bedroom paying you rent might be the man who holds your title in a safe you can't open. You can change the locks on a house. People do it all the time, to their parents, to their elders, to the ones who built the very thing they now feel entitled to. But you had better be very sure, before you change the locks, of who actually holds the deed. Because sometimes the beaten old boarder in the back room is the owner of the whole thing and has only been too kind and too grief-worn and too patient to remind you. And a home. I've learned what a home actually is, and it cost me nearly everything to learn it. A home is not the house. It's not the deed even, though God knows the deed is what saved me. A home is the people who would hold the door for you in the cold. It's the daughter who would have stood in your corner if she hadn't been lied out of the room and came running the moment you called. It's the friend of 40 years who'd been waiting for you to sound like yourself again. It's the granddaughter at the bench with her tongue between her teeth and her grandmother's patience in her hands. It's a wife 2 years in her grave who built you a fortress and never told you it was a fortress, just called it keeping your name on the papers. Those are my home. Some of them share my blood and some of them don't. And I've learned the hard way at 75 that it makes no difference at all which is which. I spent 50 years as a locksmith, and I thought I understood locks better than any man alive. But I had it backwards most of my life, and I only got it right at the end. I used to think the strongest lock in the world was the best steel, the tightest tolerance, the cleverest mechanism. It isn't. The strongest lock in the world is a clear title with your name on it, kept somewhere only you can reach, held for you by someone who loved you enough to insist. Steel can be picked, I know, I've picked it. Mechanisms can be beaten, I know, I've beaten them. But a man's name on his own deed, protected by an honest hand and a plain signature, and a safe with a combination that lives in no place but his own head. That is the one lock I never learned to pick, and neither did my son, and neither did Brad, and neither did the tired man with the notary's stamp. They pushed on that door for a year and a half, harder and crueler and more frantic every month, and it never gave, because it wasn't stuck, it was locked. And they'd locked their whole scheme on the wrong side of a door held shut by a locksmith. They were so sure I was finished. That's what I keep coming back to. So sure the quiet old man in the back bedroom was already gone, already ash, already nothing but a signature to be collected and a burden to be filed away in a nice bright building that smelled of forgetting. But the man they wrote off had opened 10,000 locks that swore they couldn't be opened, and a man who's done that even once never fully loses the feel of it. You can put him on a rent schedule, you can make him small, you can wait for him to fade, but you cannot pick the lock on a clear title, and you cannot forge the thing that built the house. And you had best remember before you charge a man rent whose name is really on the deed. I'm still here. I'm still in my own house, with my own name on the papers, sleeping the good sleep. My hands still know the trade, and still know how to hand it down. There's a truck in the driveway with my keys in my pocket, and a workshop where the rent room used to be, and a granddaughter who will be a master someday, and a daughter who calls on Sundays, and a foundation carrying a good woman's name into the corners of the county where the frightened and the written off are waiting for one person to believe them. And somewhere, I have to believe, Nora is still keeping the books, still seeing straight through people clear as glass, still watching over the whole thing and smiling. Because after everything they tried to take, the one lock they could never pick was the one she set 15 years early, and it held. It all held, and the last tumbler fell exactly where she'd cut the key. They told me to sell the empty house, to come and live with them. It's cheaper, Dad, we'll take you in. And I believed them then. I sold the house that Nora built. I moved into their spare, and 2 months on my own, Son slid a rent bill down the air. I paid it. Yes, I paid it, and I thanked him, soft and slow, and let them all keep thinking that the old man didn't know. For 50 years I picked the locks that swore they'd never yield, and a lock just wants your patience, and a steady hand to wield. They forged the papers, hired the stamp, and toured the nice facility, and planned to spend my money on my own tranquility. But a woman dead 2 winters had a rule about the deed. You keep your name upon the papers, whatsoever be your need. So the house they charged me rent to sleep in, tumbler after tumbler, turned, it was mine, and always had been, and that title can't be burned. A lawyer read it in the kitchen, and the whole cold scheme came down, and the quiet man they had written off was the only key in town. Now my daughter's home who loved me, and my granddaughter's at the bench, and the room where I was made a guest is where I'll teach her, wrench by wrench. There's an empty chair for my son, and I ache, and I still write. For love you give for nothing, but trust you earn by light. So when they tell you you're a burden, when they seat you in the back, when the family that you built for you is the family on the attack, remember the old locksmith and the deed he kept in hand, and the lock a good love leaves you, still holding where you stand.